basic logic of debt is, if I have an investment opportunity that can give me a return of 20%, okay, then it is perfectly efficient to borrow at 10%. So the idea is very simple, that you're selecting the top 0.1%, unko aap rehne dijiye, right? But you take the next 0.9% and you say, let's take the top 1% of the entire UPSC pool. And then you say, we'll take the top 1% and we will empanel you, okay, to be eligible for contractual appointments. Even for a new state to function effectively, it needs a certain social cohesion about what the state stands for. Right? Politically, that is seen as inequitable because it will increase the tax rates on the poor on certain essentials. And therefore, you feel that you need to do that. Okay, so that's an example of a reform that can improve efficiency at the cost of equity.
So with this, is it good, bad, ugly? All of our conversations on Sushasan have been with civil servants, IAS officers and officers from other services who have delivered transformative impact from within the government system. Today's conversation is different. I'm going to talk to an academic who has a very deep and nuanced understanding of the functioning of the Indian state. And he's been able to combine that with evidence from global research over the last couple of decades to come up with very practical, implementable reformist ideas of how we can move and make our governance more effective. He's captured all of that in a book, his magnum opus, about a year back. And we're having this conversation today on the 1-year anniversary of that book. I'm talking about Dr. Karthik Muralidharan, and today I'm going to have a conversation with him on his book, Accelerating India's Development. Do listen in. Very warm welcome to Sushasan, Karthik. And we are doing this conversation at the 1st year anniversary of your book, Accelerating India's Development, a state-led roadmap for effective governance. So really a pleasure to have you on Sushasan.
Absolutely, my pleasure to be here.
And firstly, I want to just begin by thanking you for writing this book. I know you're an academic of great repute, and a lot of time academicians are very happy being in their ivory tower, do a lot of research, high quality research, but then publish papers, do conferences, sometimes teach. But you care enough about India's development, India's growth, that you've really taken the effort, and I would assume a painstaking effort over years. So to really encapsulate everything that you learned over the last 20 years to your research, to your work, and simplify it in a manner that it can be consumed by everyone who's really working towards India's development, right? Everyone who's either working towards or even interested in India's development. So really, thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. Like I was saying, I think, there's no greater pleasure for somebody who's done the work to kind of write than kind of having motivated readers who are enjoying it. So it's been wonderful.
Yeah, and I can share for myself and my colleagues at Samagr, we've been doing this work over the last 12 years. I know that a lot of people have really spoken well about the book. Mr. Nandan Nilekani, Vivek Debroy, TV Somnathan, Vijay Kilkar, a lot of them have really backed the book. But I can share just from our experience, right? It's really connected at multiple levels. Firstly, the premise of the book is also the premise of Samagr, which is governance is a key lever of change and state is an effective unit of change, right? And that's the starting point. Then what we have observed practically working with the government over the last 12 years is something that is very consistent with everything that gets talked about in the book. Also, the approach that we take, right, while we're doing systemic reform at the state level at Samagr, that approach is again very aligned to what you talk about here. In fact, what the book does is provides us I would say, conceptual framework, a vocabulary, intellectual heft, or the academic backing for some of the stuff that we are doing, but we never knew that this is where the theory of it is kind of coming from. And also, I would say very importantly, in a lot of places, it really pushes the envelope on the thinking and provides a lot of practical implementable ideas, which we can now attempt to implement in some of the work that you're doing. So really connected at multiple levels. In fact, I first read the book, then our leadership team has read the book, and they've picked up ideas from the book which can potentially be implemented in our work with the states. And now the entire organization is kind of reading the book in this quarter. So really thank you again for doing this.
Thank you. My pleasure. And, I think, like I've said, I think the only downside in the book, a downside in some ways is the size of the book, right? I mean, but the size was inevitable partly because you're trying to reach multiple audiences, right? So there's there's a public education function, there's a policy function, and I think the proof of the pudding really is in kind of applied practitioners like yourself at Samagra finding value. So that's one put here.
Yeah. And if I were to do justice to the full book, I think it requires around 5 to 6 hours. But what I've done instead, I've picked up few themes which I want to double click on with you. And in each one of them, I'll point to specific concepts and insights that you've given in the book, which I found to be really interesting. I would request you to share those and then quickly shift attention to some of the ideas or solutions. I think those have been talked about a little less, so we can emphasize or spend more time on those. In fact, apply some of these concepts and insights even to contemporary topics which are under discussion and keep coming in current affairs and in news from time to time. So that's how we'll do. We'll go from one kind of theme to another. And after that, I would also love to hear from you the process of writing the book and your own journey of writing the book. In fact, also the journeys over the last 1 year since the book got kind of published. So we'll cover that in the end. But before I even get started with the first theme, can you quickly, Karthik, share the structure of the book for the audience, those who haven't yet read it? How is the book structure and what do you kind of aim to cover there?
Correct. Thanks, Gaurav. So, I think the key premise of the book, like you've said, is that most of our discussions on policy and development in India, we focus on what should the government do, but we don't ask how will it do it, right? So it's really kind of moving the discussion from the what to the how. So there's this old saying in India that, oh, we make great policies, but implementation is weak. But why is implementation weak? And implementation is weak because you haven't paid enough attention to the inner functioning, right, of the state. So I think the book is broadly in two halves, right? So there's the first half, which is building an effective state, which is how do you actually build effective state capacity? And none of this is rocket science, right? It's basically principles of effective organizations that apply just as well to public, private, and nonprofit organizations, right? So, but you really have to so the core premise of the book is you can't deliver better development outcomes at scale unless you actually fix the inner functioning of government, because that is your biggest vehicle to reach, at scale. So that's the first half. But the second half is equally important because we're not doing state capacity just for the sake of building an org, right? The whole point here is we care about accelerating development. And so then how do you take those principles and then use that to drive change in key sectors, right? So education and health, education and skills, health and nutrition, police and public safety, courts and justice. So social protection and welfare, and jobs, which is, crucial. So I think those are the two key halves of the book. But there's more than that because there's two important chapters in the front and two at the back. And so there's two chapters in front on the key actors, right, which is understanding the incentives and constraints of the two key actors of the state, who are the politicians and the bureaucrats, right? Because at the end of the day, your typical tax-paying upper middle class Indian doesn't really understand the lives of these actors. There's this general sense that our government is not doing what it has to do, but nobody kind of really understands why or how. And there are some, relatively simple-minded views of what the reasons are. So those first two chapters really provide kind of the context to make sense of why we are the way we are. And kind of every chapter has been, so, my macroeconomics professor at Harvard, Greg Mankiw, he used to be, when he spent 2 years as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president of the US. And when he came back, he wrote this very nice paper called The Macroeconomist as Scientist and Engineer. Okay. And so I've tried to apply the same principles in writing this book, which is, as a scientist, you're trying to understand the world. As an engineer, you're trying to use that understanding to build a better world, right? So the structure of every chapter follows exactly that approach, which is the first half of every chapter is science. Let's understand the facts, let's understand the research, and let's understand why we are the way we are. And the second half is, with this understanding, how are we going to make things better? Okay, so that's kind of the structure. And then the last two chapters, which is also very important, is, see, the core of the book argues that even under the current incentives and constraints of politicians and bureaucrats, that they should want to implement kind of the ideas in the book. But in the last two chapters, I then discuss, okay, how do you kind of deepen this, right? And so that is kind of the making it happen part. And one key chapter there is on reimagining institutions, so that this way of doing governance is not just a one-off project-based thing, but is really becomes a way of functioning within the government, right? So there's an institutionalizing agenda. And then there's a last chapter in state, citizen, and society, which is, I think, in many ways, Samagra, all organizations that are working in this space, in a way, are actors in that last chapter, right? So I think we often make a mistake as citizens of saying government should do this, government should do that. But government can't do everything. And so you really then have to think about not just complaining, but how do you become a part of that solution, right? So that's kind of the overall structure of the book. And again, the only kind of since you've read it, you can confirm this, right? That it looks scary in size, but each chapter is like a mini book, and each chapter is kind of an easy read. So that's what I would recommend viewers to kind of pick up and read that way.
I think this provides a very good kind of overview of the book for those who are yet to read it. So strongly recommended. So let's get started with some of the content, Karthik. The first theme I want to talk about is human resource or personnel, right? Over the years, when people ask me that you've been working in the governance space for more than a decade now, what's the key kind of challenge? The first thing I would say, it's the human resource management problem, right? Where you, right from the stage of planning of how many people you need, then recruitment, then training and capacity building of those people, and very importantly, performance management, right? In the private sector, you have all the levers. You can incentivize, you can give a bonus, you can kind of give an increment, you can hire, fire, promote. None of those levers are actually available in the government practically. How do you really get a massive workforce to kind of work? So there are challenges at all levels, and you really go deep into this as part of the book. Two things that I found very interesting in terms of insights that you present, and would love for you to share those. One is the fact that you shared that India is a really understaffed bureaucracy. Unlike popular perception, where you believe the bureaucracy is kind of really big, and that sometimes those comments come just by looking at the top, the number of ministries, the number of departments, but really when it comes to middle management, which is, let's say, the district level, or the frontline workers, which are really interfacing with the citizen on a day-to-day basis, your school teachers, your Anganwadi workers, healthcare workers, police personnel. You look at it holistically, the entire pyramid, then it's really understaffed, right? So that's something I wanted to talk about with kind of comparisons with data and so on.
Yeah, and I think, so like you said, this is something that most people think of the Indian state as this bloated, inefficient entity. And in some ways that might be true, because it has presence in places where it need not be. Okay. So, and often kind of acts as an impediment. But when it comes to its capacity to impede is very high, but its capacity to serve is very low. Okay. And so when it comes to the frontline service functions, that's where you're massively understaffed. Okay. Now, there are many reasons for this, but one key reason, which again, most people don't realize, is that Indian government employees are actually among the most overpaid in the world. Okay, if you look at this compared to both private sector as well as compared to GDP, the ratio of salaries to GDP. Okay, so simple example I'll give you. In education, okay, if everybody says to get better education outcomes, you have to increase education spending. But China and Vietnam have delivered better education outcomes, spending less than India. Okay, and the key is that in fact salaries are actually much lower, and there is much greater accountability, and there is more staffing. Okay, so the core problem of the Indian state is that we pay too much and we hire too few. Okay, and you can see the consequences of this even in the structure of labor markets, because it is not just something that affects the state capacity. The fact that you have 200, 300 applicants for every government job itself tells you that the terms of the government job are completely disconnected from the market. And that in turn has implications for skilling and employment, which we can come back and talk about. But the core challenge is this, right? So you don't have enough staff. But then the ones you have, it's not that there is not accountability. There is accountability, but the accountability is all for compliance and process and not for outcomes. Okay. So there's a core principle of effective organizations and organization management that says you provide autonomy to the frontline worker on process, because the frontline person is the one who's close to the problem and knows how to fix. So if you wait for head office to tell you what to do, it's already too late. Okay, so you need to empower the frontline person to solve the problem, but with accountability for the outcomes. Whereas in government, we do exactly the opposite. You micromanage on process so that there's very little autonomy, but there is no accountability for outcome. So one of the favorite examples of this I like to give, because people understand from popular culture, right? So my own work on education technology, right, where we say that even if you sanction the budget for computers and schools have computer labs, you'll often go to the labs and see that the lab is locked and the chabi did the headmaster. Okay. Now, why is that? It's because nobody is holding the headmaster accountable for whether the children are learning. Okay. But if other computer kahin se chori ho gayi, to aapki band baj gayi, right? Like, means, so your incentives are to make sure कि ये computer चोरी नहीं हो रहा है. Right? So that's where you then have to think through the incentives of each actor, right? I mean, as a policy goes from policy down the ground. So, and you see this in Panchayat, right? So there's this whole episode called Computer Nahi Monitor, right? Like, I mean, where basically nobody cared computer use हो रहा है कि नहीं. Like, वो monitor चोरी हो गई, तो this is entire episode where you see the trouble he's going through, right? So the point I put about the bureaucracy is that We are understaffed. It's not managed effectively. The staff don't have the autonomy or the empowerment to deliver. And it also, the managers, even if you have, so first of all, at the managerial level, there are massive vacancies. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Can you share some statistics in terms of comparative also? And
so yeah, sorry. So in terms of the headcount numbers, so, sorry, I missed that, right? So India, and again, this is slightly outdated. It's maybe 7-8 years old, but when the last time comparable data was available, India had about 16 employees per 1,000 citizens, compared to about 159 in Norway, right? So we're 1/10 the staffing of kind of Scandinavian countries. Now those are high income welfare states. But even compared to the US, it's about 1/5. The US there was about 77. Compared to China, it's about 1/3, which is about 57, right? So we are dramatically understaffed at the frontline level, but also we are understaffed at the managerial level, which is further complicates the efficiency of the utilization of your existing staff. So in one of my papers on teacher absence, right? So one very, very robust finding is that schools that have been regularly visited by a supervising officer tend to have much lower absence. But if you don't have the supervisor position filled, you're not going to have those visits, right? So they estimate that the return on investment of filling a supervisory position is actually 10 times higher than filling a frontline position because of the leverage that you get from better management.
yeah, I can also kind of second that through the practical experience that we have. Every state, any department that we work in, there's 30% vacancies kind of is not at all. It's very, very common.
Okay.
Right? It's very common, be it at the supervisory level, be it at the block officer level, the district officer level, and people have dual charges and so on and so forth, which makes it very, very complicated to deliver.
Yeah. And the problem is that I think it's a twofold problem, right? So from a finance department's perspective, so there are two challenges, right? One is we don't have enough even sanctioned positions. But the second, even again, sanctioned positions, you have so many vacancies.
Yes.
So then the question is, why do you have these vacancies, right? And so one reason, and this goes back again. So one thing that's worth highlighting in the personnel problem, which I think is very counterintuitive, okay, but I think people, this is worth kind of going through the logic, is the normal thing you think about is you need to pay high salaries to get good talent, okay, and that's why they pay high salary, right? But in practice, when you pay too much relative to the market, it's actually highly counterproductive in multiple ways, right?
And can you also explain that with numbers? Because this thing that you say that bureaucracy is kind of, at least the frontline workers are overpaid, right, vis-a-vis the Indian market. I think that's also sometimes may not be very intuitive to this thing. So you can give some statistics there and then come to the kind of, you can say, perverse incentives that creates.
Exactly, right? So from one of my own studies, right, you see, and this is multiple studies actually have showed this, that if you just compare the teacher salaries of government teachers and private teachers, like, excluding the super elite private schools, okay, if you just look at your average private school, the government teacher salaries is probably between 3 to 10 times higher, okay, like mean than the private schools, right? So UP, it's often 10 times higher. In Andhra, where I have data, it's like 6 to 8 times, right? So
and here we're talking about low-income private schools, the kind of this. We're not talking about the DPSs of the world.
you're not talking about the super fancy, like high-end schools that cater to the top 1%, right? But if you look at not even your affordable private schools, most average private
private
that cater to middle-class folks, like teacher salaries are substantially lower, okay? So now you might think that high salaries allows you to get good talent, right? But what the research shows is that there is zero correlation between the level of pay and your effectiveness on the job, okay? And education is in fact an area where, because measuring productivity in the public sector is quite difficult, right? So some of our best research on public sector personnel management comes from education, and that because in education, when we have what we call longitudinal data, that every year we know what learning level a student has come with and what they're leaving with at the end of that year. And you know which teacher they've had. So you can match the learning gain with the characteristics of the teachers. And that's where you see that kind of the level of pay has no impact, right? And even the qualifications, this typically doesn't have an impact. And we can come back and talk about that, okay? So the point is that the level of pay doesn't seem to get you kind of higher productivity. So, but the funny thing is, it actually creates a whole bunch of perverse incentives, right? So why does it actually kind of hurt the system? And hurts the system for at least 4 or 5 reasons, okay? The first simple one is that's why you can't hire, because each slot is so expensive. So the finance department is petrified to sanction new posts because it's a fiscal commitment for 30 years or 40 years. It's a lifetime job. And once you're employed, it's like really difficult to get the accountability to get the work done. So they are almost, so you're in this ridiculous third best thing, right? First best is to hire with accountability, right? Yeah. But because you're not able to do that, they say, nay, we will just leave it vacant because, that's still better, kind of, at least better, right? So that's kind of the first problem. The second problem in the pay is so high is that because so one of the reasons for the vacancies is that the logistics of running recruitment has now become like running a military operation. Right?
Yes.
So, because the government job is so high stakes that you get hundreds of applicants for every job.
And this you're talking about teachers, even for group D employees, right? Peon, gardener, kind of cooks. I remember one recruitment from Haryana. We had 18,000 group D vacancies. We have 18 lakh people apply for it. And special trains had to be run, special buses had to be applied for just to do the examination for that, right?
Exactly. And so, but then you see, right? So what you've done is when you make when the pay is so completely dealing from the market, right? Effectively, so you can never get away from the market too much, because what happens is that's what creates such a fertile ground for corruption, right? Because the stakes are so high.
The lifetime value of a job is kind of very, very high. You're willing to kind of pay.
Crores, right? Like the lifetime value of a government job runs in crores. So of course people are willing to kind of, pay the bribes. And so that's the market, right? I mean, if why did we have smuggling? Like, whenever you kind of do something where the private payoff to doing the corruption is so much higher, it will happen. Yeah. Okay. So one is therefore so the logic of high pay getting you good talent is completely subverted by scams and recruitment, right? So you increase the likelihood of corruption because you make the stakes so high. That's problem number one. Problem number two is you can't fill the vacancies because running the recruitment has become so difficult, right? That any well-functioning organization should have a steady annual process of recruitment. But the reason you have these big vacancies is because 4-5 साल recruitment होता ही नहीं है.
और जब होता है तो court, it goes to the court because it's such a complicated operation that somebody or the other will.
By making it so high stakes, you actually paralyze the system. Yes, right. So it goes to courts. You need to
corruption.
You have to worry so much about corruption. And so inevitably what happens is these recruitments get announced like a year before the elections, because the politicians see the jobs not as service provision, but as rewards for the people who get the job. So that itself is a fundamental mindset shift that we need to make, that the purpose of public jobs is not job creation. The purpose of public jobs is service delivery, because we are paying for those jobs with taxpayer money, right? So the entire logic is inverted. And so you get then this problem that you can't run the recruitment because it's become so high stakes that, officers just don't want to touch it, right? So then you got a third problem, which is because the government job is so lucrative, that you have candidates who are kind of applying for any possible government job without any interest in that actual job. Okay, so we have legions of stories which I talked about in the book of people who will apply for forest guard, who will apply for, railways, teachers, anything. They don't care. As long as sarkari naukri hai to bas, that's what you're looking for. So, but the implication of that is when you think about this, the motivation for service delivery, there is no motivation for that actual sector you're in. Okay, so which is another reason why why finance departments don't want a sanction. They're like, ठीक है, vacant ही सही है, because जो बंदा आएगा ज़्यादा काम तो नहीं करने वाला, like, so why bother? Yeah. So, but you see how, and then it creates other perverse consequences, right? So the structure of the high pay is also the single biggest cause of youth unemployment in the country. Right? So you have studies now showing that even in Tamil Nadu, which is an otherwise kind of, strong private sector state, that 80% of unemployment of educated youth in the 20s is because they're writing government exam after government exam after government exam. Okay. So the perversity of that for the larger kind of skilling in labor market is that people don't want to get skilled, because why do we produce an education system that has lakhs of graduates who can pass exams but don't have any real skills? And that's because the most lucrative employer in the economy only cares about passing exams as opposed to ability to do anything real, right? So this is then these spillover effects of kind of what in economics we call general equilibrium effects, of kind of how the structure of public sector labor markets ends up kind of distorting the entire economy, right? And this is one of the most important problems I think we need to fix. I mean, recently Bihar, Jharkhand, I think I saw an article that they've not been able to run recruitments, like even the military style security, papers get leaked, right? It's impossible. So you've tied yourself in knots where you just cannot function this, right?
No, it's absolutely bang on, Karthik, and again resonates a lot with what we see on a day-to-day basis when we work with the government. I want to, one of the good things that you do in the book is you're not suggesting grand solutions to grand problems, right? While you're articulating the problems, you are coming up with very, very practical, implementable ideas which will head us in the direction of the solutions, right? And they work in the political economy of the day, right? One of the ideas on this front that you talk about is the idea of Practicum Apprenticeship. Can you explain that? I think that's a very, very interesting one.
Yeah. No, and thanks for picking up on that. In fact, I consider that one of the most important ideas in the book. And multiple government officials have actually said if we manage to do this one thing, it will be transformative, right? So for Samagra, maybe this is something that you can apply your mind to. But here's the core idea, right? The core idea is that if you look at where the biggest needs are in terms of headcount, okay? They are in frontline service delivery jobs, right? Education, health, police, okay? Now, the problem today is if you look at the research shows, at least in education, again, that we have the best research.
So teacher, ASHA worker, teacher, Anganwadi worker, police, nurses,
So health,
police constables.
sorry, health and police, right? So again, like I said, the best research is in education, right? But what we see is the two important facts. One, there is zero correlation between having a teacher training credential and your effectiveness in the classroom, okay? Now, this is not to say that training does not matter, because I'm a professor, right? I clearly believe in training. So it's kind of, it's not something I feel very happy to say that the credential seems to have no effect, right? But let's unpack that a little bit, okay, and understand why does a teacher training certificate have zero correlation with your effectiveness in the classroom, okay? Now, the first reason is many of these certificates are fake, okay? And so there's a degree mills that are providing them just so that people can apply for the teacher job, okay? So it's not a surprise that that has no effectiveness. But even if you look at the genuine degrees, okay, where people actually have an education degree, the problem is if you go look at a content analysis of the curriculum, okay, most of this is history, theory, philosophy, sociology of education, okay, but remarkably little practical skills of how do you teach and how do you manage a classroom, okay. So at best, you might have some observation, okay, that you're made to go see some and take some notes, okay, but you don't learn to bicycle of you don't learn bicycling by seeing somebody bicycle, right? You learn it by doing it. So in all of these kind of practical areas, it's the research is very clear that the best way to do training is kind of training on the job with kind of constant supervision and observation by somebody senior. And that's how we train our doctors, right? That's how you do the internship. That's how you do the round. Okay. So the fact number one is that the current status quo of training and skilling is completely broken. Okay. It's dysfunctional. It is okay. And whereas the kind of skilling that works is the practical co-op model, whereby you're interspersing theory and practice. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two is that we also have a ton of research showing that, particularly for primary service delivery, right, you don't need super fancy qualifications. Okay, so there are tons of studies that show that locally hired kind of Shiksha Mitras contract teachers who are often, 12th pass or college graduates, but no formal credentials, are as effective, if not more effective, than your highly trained.
Yes.
Okay. So when you take these pieces together, right, the idea of the practicum is very simple. So let me articulate the idea and then explain how it solves a whole bunch of problems. Okay. So the core idea of the practicum based training was relatively straightforward, right? Which is, imagine that you take a set of high school graduates or college graduates. We can even work with 12th pass, okay? And saying that you're going to create a practicum based integrated teacher training program that intersperses 9 months of practice with 3 months of theory, okay? So imagine now that you even have a college degree, okay? And then what you say is the 3 months you go and get the first module of your theoretical training of classroom management, basic aspects of how children learn, how to interact. And then you do 9 months of practical training where you are actually teaching, where you're assigned to a school in your village, in your community. And during this practicum period, you're actually paid a modest stipend. Okay, you're paid a stipend because you are contributing to the teaching of the children, but you are also learning and you are being guided by, the senior teacher who's in the classroom. And then every 3 months, you go back and look at your next part of theory, right? So at the end of this period, you will end up with a teacher training credential, but it's a practicum based credential.
And this is how long?
So I haven't given, and the details, it could be, if it's a diploma, it could be 2 years. If it's a degree, it could be 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So those
2 to 4 years, 3 months in theory, 9 months in a government school, teaching alongside a
regular teacher. Okay. Now, so and then the other key part of the innovation is to say that at the time of regular government recruitment, okay, that you will provide some extra points for every year that has been served in a practicum based training program. Okay. And it doesn't guarantee it, but just a few extra points. Okay. Now, once you just do these two basic changes, you can get a transformative impact, okay, in the effectiveness of public service delivery. And so, where does that come from? So the first is you're dramatically improving the quality of trainees, because the research shows that this is, and in fact, what you can do with the newer generation of trainees is you can also create digital modules. And then once you have the 3 months in the classroom, you have kind of peer-based WhatsApp groups whereby weekly you kind of send content and people have peer groups. So you kind of have this contact between the trainer and kind of the practice, right? So you dramatically improve the quality of training, right? So that's benefit number one. Benefit number two is that you're augmenting state capacity for service delivery in a fiscally feasible way. Okay, so a regular teacher salary might be 50,000 rupees, which you can't afford. A stipend would be about 3 to 5,000, and that is actually quite substantial. And I'll come back and tell you why, even if 3 to 5,000 in many parts of rural India, that will be incredibly lucrative and attractive to candidates. Okay, so you are augmenting state capacity for service delivery in a fiscally feasible way.
You're increasing the number of teachers at 1/10 the cost.
Exactly. Well, so but that's why I don't want to call them teachers, right? You have your regular number of teachers, and I'll come back with why this is a big improvement over, say, contract teachers. Okay, which is very important to keep in mind. Okay, but let's think about my own experience where my child in the US, when was attending preschool, he was in a class of 24 kids, and there was one teacher and 3 teaching assistants.
Yeah.
So there were
These people get
PTA
the
was
teacher.
effectively 6 to 1, and so you were able to create these learning stations where each teacher was able to work with children at their level, doing kind of a small group instruction, but under the overall supervision, right? Like
Yeah, so they can assist the regular teachers.
right? And so, but you can adapt this so much in India, where one of our biggest problems, see, I mean, even with the focus on Nipun, which is wonderful, we haven't solved the multi-grade problem, right? When you go to a typical school, you have 2
In the same classroom, you have students from grade 2,
But
grade 3, grade 4,
because
grade
a typical
5.
rural-
Because the teachers are less in the school.
A typical rural school has 30 to 40 children, on average. And if you have 2 teachers and 5 standards, then you simultaneously have the teacher having to work on multiple grades, right? So this is augmenting the state capacity for service delivery, right? In a fiscally feasible way. I mean, that's a second key benefit. The third benefit is, because you give points to kind of regular recruitment, you are improving the long-term pipeline of people who are coming into education, because these will be people who have shown they are committed to education.
Yeah.
Right? So it is not like कल मैं रेलवे गार्ड का एग्जाम ले रहा था, आज मैं आके टीचर का एग्जाम हो गया, यहाँ पे भर्ती हो गई.
Committed to education and also trained, right? Before even they join the service as regular teacher, right? So they improve the quality of recruitment.
Yes, right? So the quality of training goes up, and the quality of the match goes up. I mean that I am now in a profession that I have shown a passion for, as opposed to just applying to whatever government job lottery ticket I managed to win. Okay, so that's the third benefit. The fourth benefit is it also improves female labor force participation in women's empowerment, right? Because one of the greatest barriers, see, and we can talk more about this, right? But then you look at where rural India is, right? You kind of have to meet the problem where it is, right? And so you often have today 12th pass educated young girls who are in villages who would be able to contribute productively, but for a combination of cultural and safety reasons, are not
They
able
can't be travel, right? So there they can get the job in their own village.
So creating meaningful employment opportunities in the village is kind of transformative, both in terms of their own empowerment and also the role model effects for girls, for the younger girls. So to see just how often this is, even in Tamil Nadu, okay, so which is one of the better HDI states. So in post-COVID, right, they did this program called Illam Thedi Kalvi. That was a COVID learning remediation program where they hired 2 lakh volunteers. Okay, so these were typically young women in the age of 20 to 30 who had a college degree or 12th pass and who were in the village. And they were just doing 90 minutes of supplemental kind of teaching, typically 4 to 6. Now, the reason I mentioned this is that the stipend paid for this was only 1,000 rupees a month, okay, just 1,000. And even at a stipend of 1,000, you got 4 times the applicants as the number of openings, okay? And that tells you how, and when we did the qualitative interviews, the number one reason for this is the empowerment and the dignity in the community, and not even the money, right? So what this does for women's empowerment in terms of creating socially sanctioned roles that allow you to come out, that's what they say, like, otherwise we don't leave the house, like, so that gives us a reason to leave the house and engage the community, right? So it's a huge win for women's empowerment as well, right?
And also these people, if they come here, even if they don't get through the government job later on, they can be absorbed by the private sector because there's a huge demand for teachers in the sector.
Right? But then that was going to be the next part, which is, why do I want to do this for these 3 sectors? Okay, because education, health, and public safety, these are all areas that the private sector has 3 times or 4 times as many people, right, as the government. So part of the practicum-based program is to also then integrate with kind of the private sector, so that this credential is then valued highly over there. And in fact, I will go one step further and saying something like health, you can almost have like the best candidates. So normally we think that the ultimate life ban gayi agar government job mil gayi, okay? But in health, the better outcome might be that you get so upskilled that you get the foreign posting, because there is a huge returns to kind of short-term, particularly in geriatric care, right? So you can think about a whole cascade of skilling, where there is a level of skilling that makes you kind of, gets you the job in the private sector. There's a next level of skilling, which is what you should need for the government job because it pays better. And then there's a level that takes it low. Okay. Now, But let's kind of connect this idea with the past and the research. Okay, so it's not like variants of this idea have not been tried. Okay, so it's very important to understand what worked and what did not work. Okay, so in the kind of 2000s in particular, many states experimented with different models of contract teachers. Okay, so you had Shiksha Mitra, Shiksha Karmi, Vidya volunteers, different.
Yeah, but that's a different model than this.
But there are similarities, right? But so it's important to understand what the similarities are and what the differences are. So the similarity is the fact that you were getting kind of, often young high school graduate young women to go teach. Okay. And the evidence is very clear that they were very effective.
They're very effective, yes.
But what was the problem? The reason that model failed is it failed for three reasons. It failed for ideological, judicial, and political reasons, right? So in ideological terms, basically the teaching community hated the idea of untrained teachers. Okay, so your apex national institutes, NEPA, NCRT, just vehemently opposed that this was a long-term deprofessionalizing of education. Okay, and this should be discouraged. Okay, but it was fiscally attractive, right? And so the finance department would say, I have to do SSA, and how can I get the teaching positions without doing this? Okay, so that was how it happened. The second problem was judicial, because you had these kind of volunteers doing the same work side by side with regular teachers who were being paid 10 times more. And so they would go to courts and sue for equal pay for equal work. And the courts would occasionally say, you have to do this. And then you have to stuck with all the back pay. And then the last is because you were getting these co-course or contract workers without any regularizing, the political pressure would build before elections, and then you would often get the pressure to regularize. Okay, and so Madhya Pradesh is actually a good cautionary story, right? Because in my all India data on teacher absence, what we saw in 2003 was MP was one of the best performing states. Okay, because the Shiksha Mitras were local, they were accountable, and the absence rate were among the lowest in the country. By 2010, number had gone up to 26%, and when we went back in 2016, that number had gone up to over 30%. Why? Because what happened was they had frozen regular recruitment for a long time. And then they did some en masse regularization. And then you got the worst of both worlds, because you got neither the qualification nor the accountability. And then you were stuck, with a permanent kind of quality teaching folks. Okay. So we need to learn from these lessons and be very, very clear that this is not about contractual employment. This is fundamentally a proposal to improve skilling.
Yeah.
And the way it solves all three problems is that you're making it very clear that this is not about deprofessionalizing training. It's about improving training. So this is something that any sincere teacher educator should actually be a huge supporter of, saying this is the right way to do high quality training. Okay. So it improves training. The judicial problem completely goes away because it's a well-established norm that during this is training and it is ring-fenced within your education. It is not like a permanent contractual employment where you're not getting paid.
And there's no this thing of regularizing and so on.
There's no concept of regularization because it is part of your training. It is not an employment contract. It's a training. It's a training component. And the last thing politically is because this is not like you're creating a whole bunch of people who then are going to agitate for regularizing, because what you're doing is you're creating a credential that has value in the private market. And because of the points-based system, it's a transparent system whereby, see, the political problem happens when you don't do regular recruitment and freeze it for 10 years. Then everybody will say, bharti karo, bharti karo, bharti karo. And that is what everybody says, right? But here you're saying you're going to build a long-term system that you will continue doing your regular recruitments at the pace that you want. And this is a transparent way whereby you are giving priority to people who've shown the commitment to the sector. So which is why I think this is something that in education, public safety, okay? Public safety people don't think about this, but private police, private security today employs about 3.5 times as many, as in the government, okay? And because the police is massively understaffed, and as I say in the police chapter, because police historically in India is focused much more on protecting elites rather than masses. Once you look at the skew, the spatial skew, there are many parts where even a population of 1 lakh doesn't have an actual police station, or actual approach to kind of police, right? So the idea here is during the practicum, these are not people who will have formal police powers, right? But they become kind of a community connection, right? By being assigned to a police, a thana. And then I even have this idea of saying, if you're doing this for 3 years, but for each year of your program, you get one more badge, you get a living uniform, you get a little respect in the community. But there's a lot of evidence showing that kind of this kind of community outreach based policing. So you don't, and you also increase citizens' trust with the police, because during your practicum, you don't have any arrest powers, you don't have any coercive powers.
Yeah.
All you have is the ability to facilitate dispute resolution and kind of escalate to the formal police if something that is needed. And you're also able to do a bunch of the administrative tasks, right? That even help free up the time of your regular. So it's something that really can be transformative in each of these sectors to strengthen skilling and strengthen state capacity in a fiscally feasible way. And multiple officers who've read the book have said that they find that one of the most compelling ideas. I think the challenge again in making it happen is that you have to align so many different stakeholders and kind of have a clarity of where this is going. But I hope, as early as the coming year, that we could maybe start to work on this.
Great. No, I think this is a very interesting. Another very good idea on the personal front that you touch upon on the book, I wanted to quickly share that before I move to the next theme, is the idea on contractual folks basis UPSC.
Exactly.
Because Union Public Service Commission, the body that kind of recruits the IAS and other kind of civil services, is seen to be above board. While there are a lot of recruitment challenges across different other recruitments that happen, but that's considered to be the gold standard, and therefore leverage that to somehow get contractual folks. Can you explain that very quickly, very big?
And again, so and it's wonderful. It's so obvious, like you're so deeply steeped in this because you picked up the two ideas that I consider the most important, we read the chapter. And so, this problem about understaffing in government, it exists at every level, right? So not just at the front line, but you go to any government office, the truth today is that essentially the consultants are running the country. Okay. So you've got folks from the big four consulting firms sitting in every government department. And that is a rational response to the fact that there are no skills. A, you don't have people, and B, you don't have the skills. So the consultant model has certain virtues, right? Because people are accountable, so they do the work. People upgrade their skills, and you're not making a lifetime fiscal commitment. Okay, so that is why the consulting model has kind of filled the gap. Okay.
Yeah. So consultants typically are supposed to kind of help the government, thought partner with them, push the envelope. But right now, a lot of consultants are basically doing the regular work of the government, is what you are referring to.
Are just doing regular kind of operational work. So the truth is, in most government departments today, it'll be very hard to find people 4 levels down who can put together a PowerPoint. Okay, and these are just like basic skills that or run an Excel spreadsheet or even draft a document, right? So the challenge is, again, you don't have enough people, and the ones you have don't have the right skills. So how do you fix this problem? Okay. So the other thing we haven't talked about is the cost of lifetime employment, right? Because, with lifetime employment, not only do you lose accountability, but you also lose incentives to keep your skills current, right? So the intermediate, so the problem with contractual employment in 1 or 2 years is that is sometimes not fair to the employee, okay? Problem with lifetime employment is that's not fair to the taxpayer, right? So how do you find a sensible medium, okay, where you can have 3 to 5 year contracts that are long-term enough for people to invest in the job and get good at it, but it is not lifetime, and therefore you build the accountability to upgrade your skills as well as stay current and do your job. Okay. Now, the problem with a lot of lateral entry consultants, etc., is it's often very ad hoc and it is seen as, favoritism, whatever. So what you want is, it's really important to streamline this, right? So my idea here is very simple. Like you said, the UPSC exam is one of the kind of best regarded exams, but it is the most inefficient recruitment system from a public welfare perspective.
Yeah.
Because it is so lucrative, you have lakhs of candidates who apply, and we select 0.1% every year, right? Which means for every one, and each candidate studies on average 2 to 3 years, right? Which means for every one candidate who's selected, the total cost of that selection is 2,000 years of
Our studies, yeah.
people's time. Okay. It's just a monumental waste. Okay. So you're undergoing all of this fixed cost anyway, right? So the idea is very simple, that you're selecting the top 0.1%. Unko aap rehne dijiye, right? But you take the next 0.9%, and you say, let's take the top 1% of the entire UPSC pool. So these are people who have shown the commitment and understand material at the level of the top 1%. Okay. And then you say, we'll take the top 1% and we will empanel you, okay, to be eligible for contractual appointments. We'll give you about 3 months of foundational training. So this can be done mainly virtual, but some in person. So there is foundational training in core aspects of government and procedures and stuff like that. So you understand that. But then once you're empowered, you are eligible for contractual appointment in any government body, state or central, anywhere in the country.
Yeah.
And they don't have to go through another elaborate recruitment process. Okay, they can advertise a position, they can still do interviews. Now you see how many advantages you get. Okay. You are augmenting.
And they can do the interviews, also do without interviews, basis ranking,
But
the
not
pay
right,
benefit.
but also basis on fit. Okay, so today, just think about it, right? So you will get people in tax departments and state tax departments who have no kind of connection to either economics or finance or law or accounting, right? So people could have done. In contrast, in the forest department, you want people with zoology and botany, and there is no matching at all between kind of your disciplinary background and your interest in a job that you're doing. Now, in this approach, what happens is, because I have an empaneled pool of 10 people, like I mean, for kind of this pool, then I can say, listen, I need 5 people in this department, and these are the skills I want, right? I want people with accounting or finance if it's a tax department posting. I want people with botany or zoology if it's kind of in the forest department, and I want the following skills, right? So then what you have is you're creating a flexible pool that has gone through the rigor of the UPSC, that therefore has the credibility associated with the UPSC. So this is not like kahin kisi ke mama ke ladke ko consultant laga diya, right? I mean, you have gone through the UPSC process, okay? So that gives you a certain legitimacy within the system, which is important, right? Which is today the consultant doesn't have legitimacy within the system because you're an outsider who's kind of doing some slides here and there and going off, right? But to have legitimacy within the system, that UPSC process gives you that, right? Saying, I am with the top 1%, like, गर्व से कहो कि हम top 1% में हैं, top 1.1 में नहीं है, पर top 1% में तो है, right? So that gives you that legitimacy to kind of have that locus standi within the government. But then, because that makes you eligible for the job but doesn't guarantee you the job, it gives you the incentives to upgrade your skills. It gives you the incentives to work hard and just kind of become a more consummate professional. And then what I've suggested is, listen, you can hire in the beginning on 3-year contracts, right? I mean, maybe you do 2 3-year contracts and then, maybe do a 4-year contract. And then for people who are truly outstanding, after 10 years, you may just absorb them, because obviously the government also needs like a certain set of permanent staff. But you do that not at the beginning and saying this is a job for life, but you do that after 3 contractual stints, so maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And then you say, okay, now like you really kind of hit the bar of what it takes to have kind of a lifetime.
And this is not just for departments. Even let's say at a office for district collector at a district level, there's always kind of this there's a huge gap between the competency of let's say the DC and the rest of the staff. So some of them can also come at a local general administration level in that geography, right? You can also have people from the same kind of state and so on and so forth. You can have all kinds of
It's transformative at every level of government, right? So exactly. So if you go sit in a district collector's office or even a block kind of officer's office, they're chronically understaffed, right? Chronically understaffed. Okay. So which is why, again, because in India we do jugadu things, right? Why do you have all of these fellowship programs like, this good governance fellowship, this fellowship, that fellowship? It is kahin se desperately get me young vessel, like who can run, Excel and make slides. Okay. That is basically often what they're asking for. Okay. But that is ad hoc. Sometimes you kind of get a consultant. Sometimes some NGO will pay for it. Sometimes koi local university aayega. So instead of this ad hocism, okay, if we can just systematize and saying every district collector should have like a staff of 3 people, like I mean every block person should have like a staff that has these analytical skills, this ability to monitor and augment kind of capacity. But these are not lifetime possessions. And so you do this for 3 to 5 years. And then the beauty is those skills are then valuable in the private sector as well. And then long term, when you want to think about lateral entry, right? You could even imagine that some of our best officers, like I mean, have often been people who've been in the government, who've gone and learned private sector skills and then have come back and to kind of bring those skills back into the government. So this is often even a better way of doing lateral entry, because sometimes if you try to do lateral entry at a joint secretary level, people have no understanding if how the system works, right? So imagine somebody who's come and done a 5-year stint like this, right? I mean, in a field posting, then says, okay, now let me go and really work in logistics by joining some FMCG and doing like, supply chain management, so that I can learn how to get things to the last mile. And the private sector will teach me how to do that. And then at some point I might come back and saying, let me become like, come back to government and help do some of these things at scale. So I think that's another kind of very feasible, right? It is not like this pie in the sky, right? So the UPSC exam is there. So it can be notified tomorrow, right? Like, I mean, and the foundation course can be created. So yeah, my hope is that these are things that we can act on, relatively quickly.
Yeah, I wanted to touch upon a couple of other things in the personal front, but I'll park that for now. I think these are 2 big ideas there, which we have discussed at length. Let me come to the second theme, which is again a key central argument that you make in the book. And here I want to talk about growth, quote unquote, versus welfare, right? So there's one school of thought that says, which you call the growth falas, you would say the growth falas, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, Arvind Panigrahi, all of them economists of repute, that we focus on economic growth and the trickle down will happen and human development indices will get better, education, health, all of these things will get better because the demand of them for those things will increase. The other school of thought says that ultimately the goal is not necessarily just economic prosperity, but actually ease of living and kind of human development. And therefore, we should start by focusing on health, education, and so on, and that'll have a upstream effect where you will see economic growth also happen. Now, what it practically boils down to is where do you put the money? You have a limited amount of resources, budget. Do you spend in, for instance, in infrastructure, or you spend it in health and education, and that's how it becomes a zero-sum game. The argument that you make, the primary argument is you making is that this is not a good debate to get into. Whether you hold the ear from here or you hold the ear this way, ultimately everything has to happen. The more important question is what's the quality of expenditure that we are making? No matter where we are spending, but what's the quality of expenditure? Is it meeting the intended outcomes? That's the central kind of point that you make in the book. I know this itself can be discussed length, but I want to focus on something specific that you bring up after making this argument, the center argument, where you're giving a framework, a 2x2 framework to say, especially on the welfare side or in general any scheme, how do you know whether that expenditure is good or not, right? And you've given 2x2 of efficiency and equity. I want to really explain that framework. We'll also put it out as the axis that you've shown in the book. But please explain that, and if you can give one example each of where the quality of expenditure is not good and one example of where the quality of expenditure is good.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think, so these are in a way two very distinct themes, right? The first one is in chapter 10, the second one is in chapter 6. But, but they're closely connected, right? So just to kind of amplify the first point, because I think it is important, because even today, right, when you look at the media discourse, on policy budgets, all of the discourse happens at the level of budget allocation, right? And so my core point is we focus on the top line of budget allocation and not the bottom line, how that budget translates into impact, right? So the growth versus development debate, at one level, they're both right, correct? Because more growth will get you better human development, and more human development gets you better growth. So what are you fighting about? It becomes an ideological fight, right? That the center right wants capex and the center left wants social sector spending. And, and broadly speaking, the honest truth is, if you look at Indian economic policy of the last 20 years, right? I mean, with UPA, NDA, they are broadly kind of consistent with what a center-left government would do, which is expand social sector, and a center-right government would do, which is expand capex, okay? So, which is very much, that is normal politics, okay? But my point is that how can you do better on everything? That this is still a distraction from the fact that the real elephant in the room is that the translation of spending into outcomes is so bad that if you manage to improve that, you can do more of everything, okay? So that's why the book is called Accelerating India's Development, right? So we're doing well. We're a solid B plus in many ways, right? I mean, in some cases, even an A minus. But how do you do better, okay? And so then that gets to this key concept of the core ideas. How do you improve the quality of expenditure, right? So, which means in the private sector, it's very easy to define quality, because in the private sector, you have one goal of profit maximization. You can just say, what is my return on investment? And that gives me my highest quality expenditure, right? Now, in government, it is hard because they also have social obligations. You care about equity. You care about uplifting of the most marginalized, right? So what I propose is a very, very simple 2x2 framework that you can take every major line item public expenditure and assess that from its impact on efficiency and impact on equity, okay? Now, the impact on efficiency, very simply, you could just say, what is the return on investment, okay? And you can calculate that in different ways. And that's why you need the research. So this is a concept. In applying the concept in practice is not easy, okay? It takes real, proper analytical work and assumptions. And that's why, you have whole departments of economists and treasury economists, right, like trying to do this kind of analysis and work, okay? So, but conceptually, the point is very simple. Conceptually, the point is that you can have policies that improve efficiency or equity or both. So you can have a 2x2 quadrant, right? So in quadrant 1 are ideas that can improve both equity and efficiency. And I think it's useful to give examples in the others also, right? So what is an example of a reform that will improve efficiency but potentially hurt equity, okay? So that is, say, going to a uniform GST, okay? So moving to a uniform GST rate. So today these 5 slabs, it is a nightmare, okay, from a compliance perspective, okay? So that's why you get all of this thing about popcorn,
Masala popcorn versus caramel popcorn.
Popcorn and caramel popcorn and cream buns, whatever, right? So any public finance economist, okay, would say that you will improve the efficiency of tax collection, like in both compliance and kind of management, by moving to a uniform rate, okay? But the reason we don't do this is because politically that is seen as inequitable, because it will increase the tax rates on the poor on certain essentials, and therefore you feel that you need to do that, okay? So that's an example of a reform that can improve efficiency at the cost of equity, and therefore we disagree, okay? Now,
Uniform GST being the
Exactly. Moving to a uniform GST. Now, my own view over there is we should go to at least 3 tiers. Like, have exempt, normal, and luxury. At least a 5, 12, 18 car kind of madness. If you manage to compress that to one, they will solve 90% of the problem. Okay, but that's a separate issue. But coming back to then policies that promote equity but could hurt efficiency, right? So if you look at the PDS is a good example of a policy that clearly helps the poor.
Public distribution. Public ration is given to everyone.
Subsidized or free food grades. Okay. Now, clearly that improves equity, right? There's no question about that. But many reasonable people have argued that it hurts efficiency in kind of different aspects of the agricultural economy, both because of the procurement as well as the leakage and kind of the diversions, right? But I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus on is saying, guys, there are so many low-hanging fruit ideas that will improve both equity and efficiency. And on the other hand, they spend lakhs of crores on items that are bad for both equity and efficiency. Okay, so if we can just shed public attention on that, then we can build a consensus saying, ispe kharcha kam karo, ispe increase karo. And that is how to accelerate development at a given level of budget. Okay.
दोनों का एक example if you can explain.
Yeah. So two very powerful examples. Okay, so one in human development, which I care a lot about, right? So one is what you see is that putting a second worker in the Anganwadis. Okay, we estimate in this large scale study that this dramatically improves both learning outcomes and reduces child malnutrition. And we estimate, okay, based on the global estimates of the long-term returns, that this will give a return on investment of about 1,200 to 2,000%. Okay, so 12 to 20x ROI. Okay, so incredibly good for efficiency and fantastic for equity because it's the marginalized kids who benefit the most. Okay, but we are not doing it. Why? Because all of our money goes to unconditional salary increases of existing government employees because that's a much stronger political lobby. Okay, so that's an example of money goes in areas like OPS, and we can talk about those things also.
So basically, if you do unconditional salary hikes, that's a R4.
That was R4.
R4, which is bad on equity, bad on
it's bad on efficiency. Fiscal just to raise tax revenue for that, right? So there is a fiscal efficiency cost.
Yeah.
So there's a fiscal efficiency cost for that. So, but an R1 idea would be to use that same money instead of just doing the unconditional salary increase. You hire more. Remember what I said about personnel. The key problem in personnel is we pay too much and don't have enough people. But again, if you look at kind of pay commissions and stuff that gets announced regularly about where the money increases go, they typically go to unconditional increases of existing workers rather than using that budget to hire more. Okay, so that's one example. A second powerful example comes from rural development and rural welfare more generally, right? Where if you think about a program like NREGA, right? So NREGA, what the research shows is an incredibly effective program for both equity and efficiency because it targets the most vulnerable landless laborers, right? So it's good for equity. But it's also good for efficiency because what the research robustly shows is that it not only benefits those who are working, it benefits the overall economy because it pushes up the wage in there. So one of the challenges we've had in the last 10 years is a certain amount of rural wage stagnation. Okay, but what we see in our research in that period of NREGA is that NREGA plays a really important role in kind of boosting overall rural wages because it's not just benefiting people who work, it's benefiting everybody else as well, right?
Yeah, as part of NREGA, basically everyone in the rural area is guaranteed 100 days of employment typically in a year at a certain kind of minimum wages, and for that they create some village assets and so on, and they kind of pay.
Exactly. But the benefits of NREGA come both in terms of boosting the overall rural wages, but also because it creates demand, right? So we also have evidence that it increases the creation of non-agricultural enterprises and non-agricultural employment because the biggest hurdle today to a lot of kind of small and medium enterprises is actually demand. Okay, so there's a subtle and interesting economics detour here, which I'll take for a second, and it's worth doing because there's another very influential paper recently in Kenya, okay, that estimates that putting some of the money in the hands of the poor gives you this fiscal multiplier, and we'll come back and connect that to social welfare. But one of the tricky economics questions is that normally we think that when you boost demand, you will also get inflation. Okay, so the question is, how are you able to boost productivity without boosting inflation? Okay, so when you boost demand. And the key to that is when you have excess supply. So if I have excess unused supply, then when the demand goes up, I can increase productivity without inflation because I have supply slack. Okay. Now, why does this happen in rural areas? It's because if you look at when people move out of agriculture, the most common thing you're doing is setting up a small business. Okay. And if you go to any village and look at these small businesses, most of the time they're twiddling their thumbs, sitting there waiting for some customer. Right? Like so, because you have so much slack because of the integer constraint. If I could spend 20% of my time running a business, then that would make sense. But to run the business, I have to sit there all the time. So then I'm sitting twiddling my thumbs 80% of the time, right? So that's an example of how then boosting the incomes of the poor ends up boosting overall economic activity and growth, which is what we see in that table, right? That's NREGA, which is something that's good for both equity and efficiency. But on the other hand, we spend tens of thousands of crores every year on free electricity for farmers, which might be one of the single worst policies we have in the country because it's bad for equity and bad for efficiency, right? Because if you look at the landholding distributions, basically you see that the top 5% of landowning, landowners get about 50% of the subsidy.
Because the subsidy is linked to the amount of the size
It's
of land.
proportional. It's proportional to your, the free electricity. The more you plant, the more you get, right? So it's roughly proportional to your land holding, correct? So basically, the top 5% of landowners end up getting about 50% of the total subsidy. So it's incredible.
And these are really rich kind of farmers.
To be fair, they may not be rich, okay, but they may not be rich, but
they're least deserving amongst the farmers, right? So yeah.
Because overall kind of incomes in rural India are lower, even the top 5% of landowners may not feel that they're rich, okay, which is why kind of they protest, right? Because they feel middle class, but they are still driving tractors, which is already like, at the upper end of that distribution, right? So, but the point is, it's that top 5% who get 50% of the subsidies, right? So it's bad for equity, but it's also a disaster for efficiency, right? Because our biggest crisis with regard to groundwater, okay, comes from the mindless exploitation of groundwater through bore wells and free electricity, right? It also hurts crop diversification because it gets very difficult to get people away from paddy that come in to diversify because you got the
rice requires paddy requires water. Water is free because it's coming through the bore well, and you're consuming electricity and you're not
diversifying. The finance minister of a state who actually told me, he said paddy is a lazy man's crop. Okay, he says like we're giving free electricity, we are doing free procurement. Like so you just mindlessly you just have to plant.
You're given the MSP, so your purchase is kind of a sure
inside and on the purchase side, right? So, but then it's also really kind of the efficiency cost is also seen in the insolvency of the discoms. Okay, so if you look at the fiscal crisis of most of our electricity distribution companies, right, they are bankrupt, right, because of the subsidies and because the government doesn't fully cover the cost of the subsidy. And so what do? They end up cross-subsidizing and overcharging industrial users to cover for that. That hurts at industrial competitiveness, okay, and that hurts our manufacturing. So you see again in economics the general equilibrium that
so basically
spill.
And all of these are point
is when you look into pollution in Delhi in the winter, that's happening because of stubble burning of paddy, which itself that happens because they're growing paddy where they should not be growing in the first.
So groundwater depletion, lack of incentive for diversification, then heavier electricity tariffs for industry,
correct.
Then your stubble burning, air pollution. All of these are kind of reasons why it's low on efficiency and it's low on equity because of the point that you kind of made, right? So it's lose on all fronts, and it's a big quantum of the government spending, right?
And why do we do it now? The reason we do it is, see, let's be, it's not like the policymakers were crazy when they brought the idea, right? See, a lot of our agricultural subsidies come from policies in the 1960s, okay, when we were responding to lack of national food self-sufficiency and kind of the national, honor of not depending on food aid, okay? So it made sense to do all of these things to say we need to get the production. Okay? But today that's completely outlived its utility. Now, I'm not saying we should not support farmers, right? Keep in mind this, you can support farmers through income transfers, through other ways that are much less distortionary.
In fact, in the book, you suggest a way to even kind of how do you come out of this free electricity to farmers and kind of convert that from a R4 kind of idea to a more R1 idea. You can kind of
see, the idea is very simple, right? The basic principle in economics is that prices, right? Prices, like I think Alex Tabarrok famously said, a price is an incentive wrapped up in a signal or a signal wrapped up in an incentive. And the point is this, right? That prices are very important for both encouraging supply and getting demand to be judicious, okay? So the idea is I can provide the same amount of fiscal incentive without distorting the prices, okay? So imagine a reform that did the following, okay? That said, and in fact, there were some pilots on this, but again, I'll come back to why you have to win trust and why it's difficult. But the economics, so there's an economic challenge, there's a political challenge, there's a trust challenge, okay? But let's just talk about the economics. The economics is very simple. That if you can replace the subsidies and saying, I'm going to give you a lump sum transfer, okay, cash transferred, income transferred in your bank account that is equal to the value of the subsidy I'm giving you today, okay? Subsidy aapko wahi mil raha hai, but I will meter your electricity and charge you for electricity. So if you use the same amount as before, you are neither better off nor worse off. But if you conserve, you're going to be better off, okay? Because you're actually, that money is going into your account. But if you spend more, like, I mean, then it goes out of your pocket. So the key is, I can give you the same income, but I can give you the price signal so that you now have the incentives to conserve. And the moment I do that, you will automatically switch from paddy in areas that have no business doing paddy. Like, I mean, the crops, you'll get your crop diversification, you'll get a whole bunch of downstream benefits, okay? Now, so the challenge why, say, farmer subsidy reforms are, I think, one of the hardest problems we face, okay? It's because you have to get the economics right. You have to get the politics right, right? Because you have to do this in a way that nobody is worse off, okay? If you say, I'm going to cut your subsidy, the problem is a lot of the discussions happen from a narrow fiscal perspective of saying, okay, I need to save money. But then you already lost the battle, okay? Because then politically it's a non-starter, right? So the art and craft of good policy is, can I do something that's economically sensible and politically sensible by saying nobody is going to be worse off, okay?
Yeah. And how do you do that in this one? Yeah.
So how do you do that? The way you say nobody's going to be worse off is, see, let's take a plot of land, okay? Even the big farmer, okay? Even the big farmer today, okay? You say, this is how much electricity you're consuming, okay? So आपका electricity bill इतना आता है, right? So the reform is very simple. The reform is that I will give you this subsidy as a DBT, okay? But I will meter you and charge you for electricity. So if you use the same amount as before, you're not worse off, right? But if you then start conserving, you will be better off, okay? Now, so that's what it takes to get the politics right. But then this is the key challenge. The reason it fails is because you also have to solve the trust deficit, okay? So the reason that farmer will not accept this, he says, I know you very well, okay? Like, I mean, today you will promise this.
And then
Tomorrow the Dividend will happen. Once you start billing me, then you will stop the DBT, like, so I would rather take the bird in the hand today, in fact, like, I mean, of having my free electricity rather than trust you with an elaborate thing, because, and this is where I talk in chapter 1 about the challenge when you overpromise relative to what you can deliver is you end up breaking promises. And because the state has this habit of breaking promises, you have this monumental trust deficit that you cannot get the reforms done, okay? So which is why my own view of what it will take to do something like pink to solve the trust deficit, you will need to take an approach like how we attack GST, right? So doing GST took us 15 years because the economics is very straightforward, right? So the Kelkar committee wrote this in 2002, okay? So we knew what had to happen. The problem is, how do you convince states that they will not be worse off, right? So then you needed to do the trust building exercise. You needed to compensate and saying for up to 6 years nobody lose money. And then you needed to do a constitutional amendment to kind of put those commitments in place, okay? Yeah. So I think, frankly, the way we will need to do something like farm subsidy reforms. Now, maybe this is so difficult that nobody will even take it on, but GST was thought of as hard. So we have to look at, precedents to kind of create the imagination कि देखो हमसे होता है, हम कर सकते हैं. We can apply our mind to difficult problems and solve it, right? But so the way I would recommend doing this is that you would need to pass some kind of constitutional amendment, and commit that if you do this, that this DBT will happen for at least 10 years, okay? Or maybe happen for even 15 years. Now, the finance guys might say, Arey yaar, why should I make that commitment to give you all the money? The way you will save money in the long term, okay? So in the short term, your outlay will be the same, okay? You're not saving money in the short term. But in the long term, the way you will save money is because, see, today what happens when you do free electricity? Every year as the groundwater table goes lower, the amount of electricity needed
Required
same
from
water,
the same amount of water is more.
because it is non-linear.
Also, once diversification starts happening, other things starts happening. There are multiple other externalities which are kind of
So
positive.
the magic of incentives, aligning the incentives, the long-term benefits come from letting prices do their work, kind of getting the right behavior change.
Yeah.
So it's not about saving money, but over time, that's what will happen, okay? So, but that's why, say, farm subsidy reforms is such a difficult problem. And I talk about it multiple parts of the book, right?
Yeah.
So, but you have to get the economics right, the politics right, and the trust right. But I think the GST example gives us some precedents of how we might approach a problem like this.
Yeah. No, great. I think this is a very, very good example. Now that we are on the topic of social benefit, subsidy, DBT, and so on, I also want to get your thoughts on UBI. You briefly talk about it in the book, and then you also talk about IGD, the inclusive growth dividend. So you can explain that. That'll be a good kind of thing to cover in this segment.
So maybe what we can do is, say, you can say in lack of time, is that, see, people often think of welfare as freebies, right? And there is this sense, oh, this is not good, okay? One key lesson here is that we need to really pay attention to the details of the welfare program, okay? So just like we talked about in the context of Narega and farm subsidies, So farm subsidies could also be painted as farmer welfare, okay? But that is a disastrous program, right? On the other hand, something Narega is a fantastic program, right? So the key point is that the details really, really matter, okay? So, and there are some welfare programs that can be good for both equity and efficiency, and some that can be bad for both, okay? So that is the context whereby when we think about India's overall social protection architecture, right? One of the things that many people have talked about is this idea of a UBI or a universal basic income, and just saying, listen, all these government schemes or whatever, they are fragmented, they don't reach people, there are silos, there's exclusion errors, there's and all kind of challenges. So why don't we roll up a whole bunch of these things, like, I mean, and then just provide a certain minimum transfer to people,
Do away with all the schemes and have one minimum transfer to every
sort of people. And the UBI folks have kind of done some benchmark saying if you did this about 3.5% of GDP, you can actually eliminate extreme poverty. Okay, so that was the UBI discussion. Now, the problem with that is basically twofold. Okay, one is kind of there are some schemes that Narega or even PDS, okay, that I think are nationwide and probably serve a very useful purpose. Okay, so it's not practical or even sensible to kind of do away with them. But the other challenge is that the politics of this is that it is very, very difficult to cancel schemes. Okay, so the politics of this is you can only add. Okay, so then suddenly this whole UBI becomes impractical because the whole logic of saying I will roll up a whole bunch of schemes and do that means it's a non-starter. Okay, so what I have proposed is an IGD, I mean, or what I call an inclusive growth dividend, is really a variant of that, but the amount is much more modest. Okay, so what I'm saying is that if you peg it at about 1% of GDP, see today our two biggest welfare programs, PDS roughly costs about 1% of GDP, and NREGA is about 0.5%. Okay, so this would be expensive, but it would be not infeasible, right? So I'm arguing to make this the third pillar of India's kind of core welfare structure, right? Saying that a modest amount at 1% of GDP, but per person. Okay, and this is key. It is universal and for every individual.
Yeah.
And you take the amounts for children and put it into the mother's bank account. Okay, so and the logic of doing this is that what the research shows again. See, and coming back to the quadrants, right? Now we need the research, but my conjecture is this is something that improves both equity and efficiency, right? And the reason is that, and it connects to jobs, which we're not going to talk about that much, but let's not think about this as welfare for a moment. Okay, let's think about this as where does economic growth come from, right? So all economic growth happens from people undertaking investments that will give you a higher return in the future. Okay, but the research also shows that every investment is risky, right? So, and it's very clear that when we say you have to diversify to a new crop, in the first planting season, they will lose money. Okay, and it's only after you learn that you then move to a newer, higher equilibrium. Okay, so something as simple as migrating in search for a better job, okay, that involves out of pocket cost. So there is evidence that shows that providing people with money for a bus ticket, okay, to just go and search for a job actually ended up dramatically improving kind of incomes and reducing poverty, right? So the core idea in development economics is that often people can be stuck in a poverty trap whereby you are not able to undertake even these minimal investments that allow you to escape that.
too risk averse.
Because you're too risk averse and you're too close to kind of subsistence. Okay. So the key point in development economics is that normally we think that there's a trade-off between equity and efficiency. But what I want people to start thinking about is not just as welfare as charity, right? But thinking about how do you design welfare programs that allow people to kind of, get out of poverty, right? So the framing I like best, which I use in the book, comes from the president of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, where he says, we all talk about social safety nets, but the problem with the net is it catches you when you fall, but then you get stuck in the net, right? So what you want is a social safety trampoline that absorbs the shock and helps you bounce back, okay? So in that logic, then the logic of an IGD is that the amount would be what? Maybe 150 rupees per month per person, like, something in that range. So the amount is not so big that it hurts incentives for works, okay? But it provides just that bit of a cushion, right? Like, I mean, that makes it be feasible for people to undertake these investments, okay? So, and I have a whole bunch of micro studies to cite, okay, why I think this is likely to make sense. But specifically, the idea is just that also from a state capacity perspective, you then show that you have the ability to reach every citizen in a predictable way, right? Like, I mean, every single month. And so it builds both state capacity and state credibility that people say. So the interesting thing I say, the Prime Minister has this wonderful slogan, right? When he says, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, right? So this is obviously Sabka Saath because it goes to everyone, right? Sabka Vikas is again helping everyone. But the key is then Vishwas, right? Because now you have shown that the state can in fact reach every citizen in a predictable way. which is why kind of I have recommended that we think about it. Now, to be fair, we don't have the money to do this nationwide overnight. Okay. So again, just like NREGA took 20 years to pilot with like employment guarantee schemes in different states, etc., before it was pumped up. My own view is that we now, we should be able to kind of do some serious pilots. Now, the flip side is in the time since I wrote that IGD piece in 2019, the world has moved on where I think we are getting close to some of that anyway, because a lot of states are now announcing.
Yeah. I'll come to that. IGD also you call inclusive growth dividend. Inclusive because it's again for everyone, and the people who are more deserving will find this value of that money more than the other, right?
It's progressive.
Yeah, exactly. Then it's growth because you're linking it to a certain percentage of GDP. You're saying 1%, whatever, but it can kind of, if GDP goes up, this value also, amount also goes up, and it's dividend versus small amount. It's not the principal or the this full amount that you're getting. So that's the concern. It can be piloted, of course, and pilot at the state level, at the district level, and so on before it moves on. So interesting when you make it's already things are somewhat heading in that direction. A question I had for you, and this coming from the recent elections, right? We have this announcements for women in particular. Started from Madhya Pradesh with the Ladli Behna Yojana, then Maharashtra, then Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Subhadra, Jharkhand. Recently in the Delhi elections, so it's 2,500 rupees for every woman with a certain kind of criteria every month, right? Which is 30,000 rupees a year. So where does this fall into the 2x2?
Yeah.
And is it already a kind of movement towards IGD or somewhat?
Something. No, so it's a great question, right? And I think, see, there are many benefits, but there are also important concerns. Okay. So the benefit is, I do broadly think, okay, that money in the hands of women, like, modest amounts, is likely to be good for both equity and efficiency. Okay. So, there's tons of studies that kind of show that even, there are women even in non-poor households. You can have poor women in non-poor households because there is so much inequality within the household. Okay. So I think there is no doubt that putting money directly, resources controlled by the woman, is going to be good for equity. Okay. Because of kind of our long history of gender discrimination and women's lack of empowerment and agency. Okay. Now, where I think it's a little trickier is then what is the impact on efficiency, right? And so my own view is, again, that up to a modest amount, that is almost certainly will improve efficiency, both in terms of, again, the research is very clear that money in the hands of women is much more likely to be spent on health and education of children, right? And also doesn't get frittered away. Okay.
And modest is what order of magnitude? This Odisha is giving 10,000 rupees per annum. Delhi is doing 30,000 rupees per annum.
Correct. So exactly. So I'll come back to then the concern. Okay. See, the concern, why I prefer the IGD to what is happening, and this is maybe I'm just being idealistic, right? The concern is that we are moving in the right direction, but because it is a constant political one-upmanship, right? Mean that you kind of get to this cascade of, you announce something, the next guy announces something bigger, next guy announces something bigger, and before you know it, you're bankrupt. Okay. So in fact, a state finance minister I met recently actually said, yes, this is happening everywhere, but we campaigned on this, and once you come inside, you realize kind of how it ties your hands. And so maybe we need a constitutional amendment of some kind that puts a cap, okay, on what can be announced. So the reason I prefer something like the IGD is that it is essentially, by saying it's 1% of GDP, you're also kind of putting a rough cap on that and preventing this competitive race to the bottom. Okay. So the part I like about this is I think it is a good idea to put resources in the hands of women. I think a modest amount in the 1% range, I suspect, would be good for equity and efficiency. But when you get bigger, the key question is, what are you crowding out? Okay. So when you evaluate cash transfers as an economist, you can't evaluate it in isolation.
What's the opportunity cost?
What is the opportunity cost? Okay. So if you're crowding out things that are going to be more productive, okay, then it is bad. Now, here is again a senior kind of, I guess somebody who understands about politics and economics, okay, basically told me, he said, listen, this may be the best way we can improve health and education, because politically it is so difficult to improve government service delivery because of unions and other challenges, that maybe the better approach is to kind of increase, if I'll a welfare maximizing political leader who wants to say, should I put more money in my schooling system that is not delivering, or should I put more money in the pockets of poor women and let them go get the education in the market? Maybe the second is a better solution. Okay. So, and there is a lot of wisdom to that. Right? I think at the end of the day, the political class has so much kind of street smartness, right? They understand that they have to deliver. They understand that I have a set of instruments, and because of Aadhaar and DBT, this is an instrument that is less leaky, more efficient, and for a given fiscal outlay, reaches the beneficiary better. So the politician is completely rational and saying that right now that is the margin on which I should expand my spending, as opposed to trying to spend more money on education, which is going to be eaten up in unconditional salary increases, and that's going to benefit the top 5%, whereas this is benefiting everybody. So, which is why I think broadly it's a perfectly acceptable thing. The question though is, does it completely sap both our political will and the demand for trying to kind of take on the more difficult problems, right? Mean of service delivery, which is why, we need a balance, but which is why I think it's also important for government, unions and others to themselves take the lead in improving service delivery, because otherwise the whole kind of, enterprise essentially is getting hollowed out because people are voting with it.
Great. So I'll kind of close this theme around quality of expenditure here. I know there are other things that you talk about in the book, but I think these were in my mind, the most important kind of things within that. Let's move on to the next theme, which is finances, right? Both the revenue and the expenditure of the government. And I'll kind of lay the kind of basic statistics around this. So 2/3 of the total revenue gets collected roughly by the government of India. 1/3 gets collected by the state. When you look at the government of India, the key sources is basically income tax, corporate tax, the central share of GST, and some amount from custom and so on. That's the major buckets. In the state, the major buckets are the state's share of GST, then the taxes on petroleum products, then the tax on alcohol, and there's some other things like property tax and some other urban local body stamp duty and so on. So these are the main buckets. 2/3 come here, 1/3 comes here. But as far as the expenditure is concerned, 60% of the expenditure happens by the states, only 40% by the government of India. And the reason why that discrepancy in collection and expenditure percentages, because of two things. One is there's a divisive pool of the central share, which gets divided amongst the states by the Finance Commission, which is decides how much to give to different states. And second is the concept of centrally sponsored schemes, where the scheme is designed by the government of India but executed by the states. So the money for that is given to the states. And there is again tied and tied there. So these two things basically make that proportion kind of change from 2/3, 1/3 to 40/60, right? But if you look at the expenditure, how does that pie chart look like of the expenditure? Then roughly 30%, right, if I'm correct, is going towards committed expenditure, which is pensions and interest, which is your past commitments because of which you are kind of spending today. 20% is salaries of government kind of folks. And then among the remaining 50%, 15% is basically which is going on capital expenditure, which is infrastructure and so on. And everything else put together is 35%, which is a large part of it will be revenue expenditure, the welfare schemes, and some other things. So that's the broad breakup. And around overall cut 28% or 30% is what the borrowing is, which is debt. So 28-30% debt being raised, 15% being spent on pure capital expenditure. That's broadly the. So this I hope this is mota correct, right? So with this, is it good, bad, ugly, right? This is like dark green, light green, yellow. So facts are fine, but
How do you interpret this, right?
yeah.
Yeah, no, see, I think it's wonderful that you're asking this question. I think it's, the more citizens, the more students engage, right? Like, with understanding this, the better our democracy will be, right? Because in the end, it is our money, right? I think so understanding quality of expenditure is, start with people asking those questions. So yeah, see, let me kind of, say, so two things, right? See, one is when we talk about debt, the way to think about debt is that, again, it can be good or bad. Okay. So that can be good if it allows you to finance. So the basic logic is, if my project is.
So sorry, I'm interrupting you, Karthik. But before we get there, what is the overall color coding? Like to give a B plus to the overall. What's the?
Yeah. Okay. So if you want me to talk about India's overall macro fiscal hygiene, okay.
Yes.
So again, I would say we're a solid B plus A minus. Okay. And the reason I say that is at a macro, if you look at macro comparative to other countries, right? Our finances are relatively well run. We have never defaulted on our debt. We've never had a hyperinflation. Okay. So these are kind of markers of how bad things can go. Okay. If you don't have basic hygiene. Okay.
So macroeconomic stability has been a kind of.
So this is not something to be taken for granted.
Yeah.
Okay. So not having a hyperinflation, never having defaulted on our debt. Okay. So these are two big kind of markers of the overall fiscal hygiene. And in general, I think in both center and state, we've had a tradition of putting some of our most competent officials in the finance department, because politicians understand, okay, like, finance mein goche ho gaya to, then like 91 crisis we remember, like, I mean that you need competence and integrity in those departments, okay? Like, so which means that in general, our finances are well done. Now, but it's still a B plus, okay? So why is it a B plus, right? Because we don't go bankrupt, right? So which is good. But because we still spend suboptimally, right? We are not at full potential. Okay, so this is why then I want to take a conceptual look at debt itself, right? Which is that debt can be good or bad, right? So the basic logic of debt is if I have an investment opportunity that can give me a return of 20%, okay, then it is perfectly efficient to borrow at 10% because I'm borrowing at 10%, but this project is giving me 20%, okay? So as long as the rate of return on what I'm borrowing for is higher than what I'm paying, then the debt is welfare enhanced, okay? But the problem happens when I borrow primarily for current consumption in a way that, it's just like credit cards. It's just like, it's any debt, right? So at a household, what is the rule of thumb we say to households? We say it is fine to borrow for housing, like cars, for durable goods, right? Basically, because the logic is, आप 5 साल का car का EMI आप चुका रहे हो, like, I mean, and the benefit of the car that you're getting from being able to travel, you get a job, you work, is higher than the cost of the interest. So it makes sense. The same with kind of buying a house, right? Because it's an asset that over time, because of inflation, today your rent might be less than your EMI, okay? But over time, if you do the numbers properly, like, I mean, the inflation of your rent over 20 years will then exceed substantially the EMI, okay? So the reason to not buy a house is if you think you're mobile and keep moving, because then there's like, transaction cost, right? Of buying, selling, stamp, all of that, right? But if you know you're going to be in a certain place, then generally it makes sense to buy the house because over time, that's an investment that pays off. So it makes sense to borrow for that because if I didn't borrow, I could never pay for that upfront. Okay. So the logic of borrowing is well established as welfare enhancing, particularly when you're talking about durable goods, capital goods that pay off over a long period of time because it allows you to match the kind of return and cost structure, right? So tomorrow, if I'm building a road and the road has a life of 30 years, if I say that I can only build the road if I have the money today, then there are many sensible roads that will never get built, okay? But if I borrow, I think every year the increase in economic activity and the toll will pay for this, it makes sense, okay? But the problem is when I'm borrowing for today's expenditure that doesn't generate any positive growth, then I'm saddling the future with the interest of this. Okay? So that then takes me back to that first point, okay, which is that about 50% of our total expenditure is committed expenditure, right, which is salaries. And then pensions and interest are today's spending for past committed.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
the work for which I'm paying the pension today was actually delivered when the person was in service. Okay. So and interest similarly, मैं आज के पैसे से कल जो कल खर्च किया था उसका मैं अभी चुका रहा हूँ. So that is where you have to be very, very mindful about, are you in fact paying back interest for what was a binge consumption at that point, or are you paying it for investment? So my overall grade on this, again, I would say is a solid B plus A minus. When you say what color code क्या है, it is because the macro hygiene is good. The RBI is one of the best central bankers in the world. So one of the things it's useful to say, how do we discipline state borrowing? Okay, this is important for people to understand, right? Given all of these pressures, so every
And
politician
also in that, if you can bake in, right, 28-30% borrowing, 15% capital expenditure, is all non-capital expenditure not productive? It's not the case, I would assume.
it's not the case. And so
Therefore, how do
you think about that? See, which is why, again, there is no simple rule of thumb, okay? Because you could think about investing in health and education, okay? Health and education, you could think about it as capex because it is long-term human capital, or you can think about it as revenue expenditure because the bulk of the cost is salaries, okay? Which is going as today's expenditure, okay? So, which is why I think even these high-level sense of, oh, capex is good, revenue expense is bad, I don't think necessarily works, right? Because like I said, even a well-designed welfare program can actually improve productivity. Okay. So, for example, free buses for women, okay, could pay off not just in terms of equity, but could pay off in terms of economic activity and labor force participation. Okay. So, which is why you then need the research. So, my moti message is that you have to get into the details. You have to think about what is the problem you're trying to solve. And is this purely kind of targeting deprivation, in which case it might be good for equity? But can you identify areas of spending that are good for both equity and efficiency? So that's why I don't like this blanket thing of saying capex good, revenue is bad. It is the details of the spending.
And today, what would be that percentage like be? What percentage do you think 28% is borrowing, but 15% is capital? Out of the remaining 35%, how much more can be said to be good spending? Is this kind of
So I don't think it's so easy, right?
Yeah.
I think, see, the thing is when you go look at the education budget, okay, that's why you have to go look at it in detail. And every department, every sector has some items of spending that are efficient and others that are not, okay? So, and it's a good time to kind of talk about kind of government efficiency, right? Because Doge is in the news, right? Like, so, but one of the things I like to say is, if you have an unfit kind of if you have somebody who's unfit, you can get fit by diet and exercise, okay, or you can lose weight by amputation, okay, like, and so sometimes there is, so the problem in the politics of kind of government efficiency is the following, right, that the left wants to expand what the government does but doesn't pay attention to how inefficient it is. The right pays attention to the inefficiency but basically is too impatient to fix it and just wants to chop off whole departments, okay. So that's why I'm kind of resisting the urge to have simple saying this is good, this is bad. In every department, okay, there will be some things that are very good and some things that are very kind of ineffective. And so one of the things I talk about in chapter 6, right, is that the right way to do government efficiency. Now, this is a slight tangent, but it relates to overall public finance, correct, and quality of expenditure. So let me say, see, today the problem in government efficiency is that most government departments have no incentive to be cost effective, okay, because for two reasons. One is if they save money, finance will take the money back, okay. So they'll say, "Mereko kya fayda? Like, why should I bother?" Okay. And the second thing is that there is this game that is played every year, okay, where the departments will ask for more money when they know they will get, okay. Then finance will say, "Paisa nahi hai." So then they'll say, "Arey, paisa nahi diya, to isliye humne kaam nahi kiya." Okay. So you kind of become asking for budget becomes a justification for not delivering, okay. So there is this elaborate game that is played in the budgeting process. Now, but I want to focus on the first point. Okay, so let me give you a concrete example where a commissioner of education in a in a major state basically said, listen, they worked really hard to use Aadhaar and deduplication to cut out a certain amount of bogus enrollments. Okay, and bogus enrollments obviously come with costs of midday meals and downstream things and stuff. So they managed to cut a bunch of corruption. Okay, but what he said finance took the money back. Okay, whereas we had these other priorities, okay, that would have helped improve learning quality, teaching quality, precisely because all of our money goes to committed expenses. We have no money to do any of the pedagogical innovations that we want to do, okay. But finally, they took the money back, okay. So
there's no incentive.
there's no incentive, right? So one of my very, very, very simple recommendations, which I think can be really far-reaching, is to modify the budget process in a way that every year, every department is asked, okay, say, give us your top one or two new spending priorities and try to apply this quality filter of equity and efficiency, right? I mean, so why is this a good use of public fund? At least attempt, apply your mind to saying, iska ye return hoga or iska ye equity benefit hoga. And these are my top three priorities, okay? Now, as part of this process, also, you do your own internal analysis of where do you think the most waste is happening, okay? And if you have to improve efficiency, how would you know it, okay? And then my commitment to you as finance is to say that if you manage to achieve these savings, I promise you that you will get the money back, okay, to fund your priorities, right? So then what happens is you bend the government towards efficiency because each department has the best understanding. Again, it goes back to this concept of autonomy and process and accountability for outcomes, right? So the department knows best, okay, how best to improve stuff. So you don't go take an axe and saying, isko pura kaat, right? But you have to create the culture of saying that you have to identify 2% of inefficiencies every year. So that like I mean we are cutting that and using that to fund kind of the priorities. So that is an example of what I would call Doge done right. Okay, which is you change the incentives within the system to bend towards efficiency, right? So which is why this mota moti when you say what is the grade, what is good, what is bad, in every department, right?
Yeah. No. I actually meant percentage wise overall. Is there some research or analysis which says that out of the current 35% that you're spending on non-capital expenditure, there's a X percentage which is good quality expenditure? That is not the case, right? Because that's split across the
I
state.
don't think there's any research, and frankly, I don't think it's practical because the details matter so much.
Yeah.
I think, see, where the research tends to focus is more on basic aspects of macro fiscal sustainability and saying if your debt to GDP goes above a certain amount, then there is a risk of a debt trap. Okay, because see, today, if I'm borrowing in a world where my growth rate is high and interest rates are low, I might be fine. But tomorrow, suddenly, if interest rates go up by 3%, and if I'm on a floating rate or if I have short-term bonds, right, then suddenly I'm exposed to that interest rate risk, and which means that the whole debt trajectory can quickly become unsustainable, either if interest rates go up or if growth rates fall down. So there is a bunch of things in terms of what are these certain benchmarks, but in terms of quality of expenditure, I think that, see, RBI, I think recently did something interesting. I think they came up with their framework of quality of expenditure, which I think is a perfectly sensible first cut, right? Because sitting in RBI, they don't have the ability to go look line item by line item, but they can create some. But also, since we're talking public finance, it's a good time to kind of also provide an example of how India is kind of fiscally conservative and well covered, right? So one question is, the states keep announcing these schemes. Okay, like what prevents the states from going bankrupt? Okay,
Yeah, that was my question, because you keep hearing Punjab is in bad shape, Andhra is in bad shape. So what's the future for the people health?
Okay, so here's the good news and the bad news. Okay, the good news for why the states don't default on their debt is they have what is called the RBI mechanisms. Okay, and it's kind of Article 293, whereby the RBI is the banker to the states, right? So whatever money from government of India has to go to the states goes via RBI, and RBI makes sure that the debtors are paid first. Okay, so basically that's why states, if you look at, there is no bond market spread in terms of the rate at which state governments borrow, even though there is huge variation in states' own fiscal health. So why is there no bond market spread? It's because the bondholders get paid first anyways. Okay. So that is kind of, no, it's good and bad. It's good because it prevents default, but it's bad because it kind of weakens the bond market discipline on states. Okay. Because one of the ways we should improve states' incentive to become more fiscally healthy is
If
that
they have
there's
to
a
pay,
bond market.
yeah, if they have to pay more, shell out more if they are not fiscally healthy.
Exactly, right? So now where a fiscal crisis hit, now I think it happened, I think in the 90s or 2000s, where Bengal, or I think maybe Jharkhand or Bihar, no, not Jharkhand, Bihar, that they literally had no money to pay salaries. And because once you pay your interest, once you pay, then they come to the Finance Commission, they come to Government of India, they can be effectively asking for a bailout now. Okay? So which is then this, so but in a way, what happens is that process of bailout gets politically negotiated, right? Like, I mean, it's probably better for it to be negotiated through markets by just saying, like, let them on markets, right? Like, I mean, kind of provide the disciplinary device. But it's interesting that the bond market discipline does exist, but that exists for Government of India borrowings. Okay. So because Government of India has no constraints on how much it can borrow. So because the national government can never go bankrupt, because you can always print more money. But if you print money, then you get inflation. So that discipline is maintained, and that devalues nominal debt. Okay. Sorry. So this is a crash course in macro public finance, right? But bond markets provide a very important source of discipline to national sovereign borrowing. The discipline in subnational borrowing comes through the RBI mechanism and the fact that the finance department regulates how much bonds you can issue. So you can't just issue debt, right? So there are limits on how much.
States also.
States cannot just wantonly issue debt unless the Government of India agrees. So there are tight controls, and that's what prevents kind of the states from
Going
defaulting. But the problem with that is some of the better run states complain. They say, like, listen, like, we run ourselves better. We should be allowed to borrow more. But GOI ends up being more conservative on that. Okay, so that's the trade.
And do you see risk with some of the states, given the current financial health, heading in that direction of what you were talking about, Bihar and Jharkhand at some point in time? Do you see that risk, or it's just theory?
No, see, I think the problem, right? I think the problem in some ways is particularly historically for states like Bihar, right? Like, it's that because you're big in terms of population, therefore you always have a fair bit of bargaining power with the center, okay, with regard to coalition government, voting support, this thing, whatever. So you often get bailouts, like, for poor fiscal management, okay? So which is suboptimal, right? I mean, and I think, the prohibition is a great example of something that, frankly makes no sense, right? I mean, but it is kind of not only depriving the state of revenue, but it's also something that leads to kind of a diversion of law. As it is, your state capacity in law enforcement is so limited, and there's tons of evidence showing it gets diverted from more heinous crimes towards kind of.
I would want to double click on that, because at one level, it comes from the right intent, right? There is no debate on the fact that there is a clear social kind of issue that alcoholism creates and so on. But at the same time, there's a very clear economics argument to say it doesn't work. Right? Prohibition doesn't work, and not just here, but can you explain the dynamics of why does it not work, specifically in the conversation?
The basic point is, anytime you ban something, right? Like, banning effectively, it reduces, but typically will move the activity underground. Okay. So to take a step back, I think there is a difference between something that is like a true crime, versus something that is more of a public health challenge. Okay. Now, in the case of alcohol, there is no question that there are negatives. Okay. That in moderation, it is probably fine, right? But when it goes above a certain amount, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's people not kind of being able to work or get themselves out of alcoholism, there is no question, okay, that there is a problem. Right? So I'm not denying that there is a problem. The question is, just because there's a problem, it doesn't mean that a particular instrument will solve that problem, right? So the problem with prohibition is it gives you the visibility that I'm taking some drastic action. Okay, so politically it is attractive, but in practice it doesn't work. It doesn't work, and we have study after study after study that showed that basically the activity moves underground, right? So what happens is you are denying the government of the revenue, but the revenue is basically then captured essentially by mafias, okay? And the mafias are then able to buy off enough of the police, like, I mean, and this thing, that you create a monster that then becomes really difficult to tame. And we saw this with what created Al Capone and the mafia. The prohibition is the biggest friend of the mafia, okay? Because that's what allows them to.
And the law enforcement agency is spending disproportionate time in kind of catching hold of people. Corruption is something that will go up as a
And
result.
it just corrodes the whole system. So, which is why, when I say legalize and regulate, I'm not trying to in any way, discount the social problem, okay, that comes from alcohol. But you treat it as a public health issue as opposed to a criminal issue. And now let's look at Tamil Nadu versus Bihar, okay? So, Tamil Nadu has, like, literally about 30,000 crores a year of the revenue comes from excise, okay, from different kinds of alcohol taxes. So the Tamil Nadu model is saying that, listen, people are going to drink, right? Like, I mean, but let's kind of keep it legal, let's control it, and let's kind of tax it. And then that's how they use that to kind of fund all these welfare programs for women. So if you're doing prohibition, saying that this is for women, you're actually much better off, like, I mean, following a Tamil Nadu model of saying tax and transfer rather than ban and move.
So that's one argument, which is that you're letting of revenues and the revenue can be used for kind of welfare program. The other argument is also that prohibition also itself is not working. It's not that
it's not working. Exactly, right? So it's predicated on the fact that it is not. Now, you may argue that on the margin, maybe some consumption has gone down. The problem is most of the consumption now goes underground, so you don't even measure it, right? So, yeah, I think this is something that most economists will almost universally agree. Like, I mean, that there are very few things we all agree on, but I think we'll almost universally agree that prohibition makes no sense.
Got it. Coming back to the revenue and the expenditure side, I'll pick one item from revenue and one item for expenditure. On the revenue side, you talk about in the book that there is an opportunity to tax a lot more in the urban areas, in the urban local bodies, because that's where kind of they are also cash trapped and a lot of work that they can do. And the reason you make is there's several public bads which can be kind of taxed. And secondly, that any action taken is also very visible to the taxpayer so that they are maybe more okay to pay the tax. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And then I'll come to the...
So in fact, I think even before I do that, there's a key concept which most people I don't think probably understand, which is the idea of a quality of revenue. Okay, we've talked about quality of expenditure, right, in terms of equity and efficiency. But how should you think about quality of revenue? See, even most government tax officials basically think about themselves as having a revenue target. Okay, itna mere ko tax, mere ko collection karna hai, right? But the quality of revenue accounts for the fact that the cost of 1 rupee of tax revenue is actually much higher than 1 rupee, right? So, and why is it much higher? Because there is a compliance cost on the part of the payer. There's an enforcement cost on the part of the government. But most importantly, the biggest cost is the behavior change, right? That comes from taxes, because taxes are making things more expensive, okay? So, can
you explain this bit within income?
Yeah. So essentially, just think about, so everybody understands intuitively, right, that if a GST rate on something goes up, okay, then that reduces demand, right? I mean, so taxes increase the prices and therefore, it distorts economic activity. If income tax rates go to 70%, 80%, then people are not going to work, or people, like, it disincentivizes effort, right? So if the capital gains is too high, it disincentivizes investment. So every tax is a disincentive, like, I mean, on productive economic activity, right? So the key idea, therefore, of improving the quality of public revenue is you tax public bads instead of public books. So a tax increases the price, okay? So a tax will reduce the total incentive to do something, right? So if I tax investment, I reduce that. If I tax labor, I tax, I reduce effort. So, but if I tax alcohol, like, which I won't reduce, then you get a win-win, right? Like, because you're reducing your consumption and raising your revenue, right? So the whole point of quality of revenue is, like, identify the public bads and tax them, as opposed to
and let's apply that in the context of urban.
In the context of urban, okay? So now urbanly, when I talk about quality of revenue, I think there are different dimensions, okay? So the first part is that from a compliance perspective, it is economically efficient to tax the factors of production that are less mobile, okay? So if I tax capital a lot, then capital will fly, okay? Will just leave the country, right? If you tax labor too much, which is why you see people leaving for Dubai and Singapore, like,
because the tax income tax
and are not getting the services.
So
right?
tax property.
Yeah. So exactly.
Which is not showable.
So the key principle, therefore, is that it is more efficient to tax things that are less mobile, okay? Like, because the efficiency loss is lower, right? So that's principle one. So in fact, when people talk about high wealth inequality in India and say we need a wealth tax, the problem with wealth tax is that it just move offshore, okay? So the better way to do wealth tax is essentially kind of property taxes, and that includes kind of agricultural land holdings, like above a certain amount, because that's another kind of undertaxed area, right? So just to give you a sense of property taxes, India's total property tax rates and revenues is about less than 10% of what it is in many high income countries. Okay, so it's a very kind of underutilized revenue instrument. So why do I like property taxes so much? It's because it gives you many, many, many benefits, right? So the first is that there's economic principles of taxation, right? But there's also political principles of taxation. So a political principle of about tax is that if citizens see the connection between taxes paid and services received, then they are more willing to pay the taxes. Okay. So which means that the more local the government is, the more you're willing to pay the tax because you see the connection between that and your service, right? So property tax makes sense economically because it's not barbaric. It makes sense from an equity perspective because it's highly progressive. It's only kind of the wealthy who own property. It makes sense politically because you are connecting the taxes to the services. But it is also one of the most practical ways of improving decentralization, right? One of the things we've not talked about is how government in India is among the most centralized.
We'll come to that.
Right? And so that local governments relatively are very, very under-resourced and they depend on transfers. But if you look at high-income countries, the way local governments got powerful was not because they were begging for money from higher level, but because they raised their own money. Okay, so by augmenting property taxes, you are de facto strengthening decentralization and third-tier governance. And then it can, if done well, it can create a positive win-win cycle where the property tax, if it is used to provide public goods that improves economic activity and the amenities and people's demand to live over there, then it actually increases the property prices, right? Then what you're paying, what you're getting through higher property prices is more than what you're paying in terms of taxes. So it can actually kickstart a virtuous cycle, where kind of if you use your tax revenue well for service delivery, and again, I can get into arcane public finance, but here is a good test, okay, a good test of whether should the government collect the taxes and do something with it, or are we better off leaving the money with citizens? Okay, what is the answer to that question? The way you answer that question is, am I creating more public value by the government spending it than by people spending it themselves? And the places that happens is in public goods that are underprovided by individuals. So when a government comes and says, I'm going to build a park, okay, that is a public good that however rich you are in your society, you will not be able to build that park. Okay. So, but the test of whether the park made sense, okay, is to see how much did the property values go up because people value that, right? So that's then a way of saying that local property taxes are better disciplined as a way of kind of using the property prices as a way of validating are the services you're delivering creating a lot of value.
Yeah. So property tax is one. You give many other examples, right? Congestion, parking tax, right? Where some you can live.
So again, so people think that, oh, I bought a car, I have a God-given right to park. No, because the land is the scarcest thing in prime urban areas, right? And the true cost of a car is not the car. The true cost of the car is the car plus the parking plus the congestion that every time your car gets on the road, it is kind of marginally slowing down every other car on the road.
Plus the pollution.
Okay. So, which is why, again, our upper middle class tax paying elites may not like this. Okay. But there is a reason why Singapore, is one of the best administered cities in the world because they tax the wazoo out of cars, right? And they use that money to subsidize public transport. So they have among the best public transport. So the right way for the government to kind of think, see, why do we collect revenue? Why do we need revenue? We need revenue to provide services. What are the most important set of services we need for India to get to full potential? We absolutely need to strengthen urban services, right? Because urbanization is one of the most important engines of growth, okay? And we are dramatically under-urbanized relative to what say China or other high income countries are, and even within India, right? If you just look at the fraction urbanization of a state, it's a very, very strong proxy, okay, of the Kerala, because productivity is just higher in the urban area, right? So, but then how do you further unleash productivity? One of the biggest barriers is commuting time, okay? So investing in better public transport becomes one of the most important investments a government can make.
And therefore, what are the corresponding kind
But then how do you finance that, right? So the way you finance that, is by taxing cars much more. So now the registration will go to the state government, but a local government should be charging for parking much, 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 much more because that is the true cost of parking, right? And then you use that money, use the congestion charges, use the parking charges, you use that to kind of invest in more public transport.
On the expenditure side, I also wanted to pick just one item, which is pensions, right? Because often in elections, this whole thing around OPS and NPS, the old pension scheme and the new pension scheme comes up, and I know that most economists kind of favor the new pension scheme because there's a certain kind of. Can you explain what's the difference between clearly better than OPS? Not clearly in the sense nothing is clear in economics, but still, yeah. There's a broad kind of consensus on that.
Yes, broadly speaking, the old pension scheme is what in public finance we call a defined benefit scheme. Okay, so defined benefits typically means that when you retire, you get a certain committed benefit that is fixed and indexed to inflation. That is a function of your last drawn pay. Now, this is great for employees because you have predictability, you have certain guarantee, and because now to be fair to okay, so that is the defined benefits old pension scheme. Now, but what is the biggest cost of that? The biggest cost of that is that it is funded by future tax revenues. Okay. So when we say that today's money is going for past committed liabilities, it's reflecting the fact that the OPS that was paid to the old guys, the employees are happy, but it's being paid by today's taxpayer, right?
Yeah.
So the logic of an NPS or the defined contribution is a very, very, very sound economic logic. Okay.
What is NPS? Can you highlight?
Yeah. So NPS is the new pension scheme, but I'm focusing on defined contribution because conceptually that's the difference. Okay. So the OPS is a defined benefits, the NPS is a defined contribution. Okay. And the core idea of defined contribution is that the fiscal cost of provisioning for pensions, okay, should be accounted for when the service is provided. That is the full cost of employee you, right? As opposed to saying, I will pay for your salary now and pension koi aur dega 30 saal baad. Okay. Why is he getting the pension? It's because of the work you're doing now. Okay, so if I value your service, I better fully account for my cost of employing you. Okay, so the logic of defined contribution is saying at the time each year, you make a contribution and I make a matching contribution. It goes to an account that is your account. You can choose where you want to invest. There are a certain set of approved investments. And then when you retire, that is your lump sum. So that way, there is no future liability on the taxpayer when you retire. Okay, so that is the basic idea and why most public finance economists prefer NPS because it just gets you better macro fiscal discipline. Okay, so today for a politician, it's very costless to say I'll increase pensions because the cost is paid 30 years down the line. So we just want the full cost to be
Accounted for, right?
accounted for, right? So now, but from the employee's perspective, I mean, there are two key challenges obviously with the NPS. Okay, the one is that, see, one thing to be fair to employees, okay, what we forget is that the challenge of retirement savings is not just of collecting the savings, but it's also of managing it in your old age. And how do you decumulate the savings? Right? So, how do you handle your own longevity risk?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a very difficult problem. And then increasingly, as we see with kind of financial scams and cyber scams and stuff, the elderly are an incredibly vulnerable target. Okay, like I mean, and so the risk that a scam can wipe out your savings is very, very real. Okay, so there are real problems that need to be solved. Okay, now one way to solve that is that at the time of NPS, when you retire, you are getting a lump sum, but you can also choose to opt for an annuity. Okay, so there are companies that will offer annuity products, like I mean by pooling together. Because what is annuities? It's basically insurance for longevity. Okay, where people who kind of live less are insuring and cross subsidizing people who live long. Okay, but you are willing to pay for that because you don't know
Whether you live
you will end up. Okay, so there are other ways to kind of solve that. But the problem, of course, is that politically, like public sector unions are an incredibly strong kind of interest group, and obviously they prefer the OPS. And now, I think what is the compromise that has been achieved with this like unified pension scheme? In many ways, it is going back to parts of the OPS. My understanding is that the one key place where it is fiscally more prudent is, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, that it is indexing the increases to inflation and not to the salaries. And that's critical, right? Because when you look at the OROP kind of fiasco, right, part of what happened there is that because government salaries are increasing for two reasons, right? It's increasing for inflation and it's increasing because of economic growth, and salaries themselves are going up. Okay. So the point is that it is fair to commit to people that I will protect you for inflation. Okay. But to say that when you are 80 years old, like I mean, you're going to get the increments that today's workers are getting, like I mean, is then fiscally ruinous. Okay. So my understanding is that the UPS commits to protect, it is going back to aspects of the, defined benefits, but it is indexing for inflation and not indexing for wage growth. And if done right, that is a meaningful fiscal save.
Got
But those things, they're in the weeds of pension. So, but that's why there's an entire field with actuaries, like, who spend their entire life, like, just calculating mortality tables and kind of coming back and doing, estimates and fiscal viability of insurance products.
So what we've been able to do is scratch the surface of public finance bit, right? Before that, we talked about welfare versus growth, or how do you kind of instead focus on quality of expenditure. And before that, we talked about personnel. The last theme I want to touch upon is centralization and decentralization. Right? One of the big points that you make in the book is insight is that we are extremely centralized as an administration, as governance. If you compare with China, China often is seen to be that strong state which must be centralized, but it's actually significantly decentralized when it comes to governance. Can you just share this and the statistics around this? And
Yeah, exactly, right? So for most people, this is like one of the most counterintuitive kind of like, facts in the book, right? Which is, if you look at measure of decentralized, so even let's take a step back, okay? Let's think about what is the right level of centralization, decentralization before you look at the facts and how to interpret that, okay? And before that, I'll take an even further step back. Sorry, I'm a professor, I have to do this conceptually, right? Which is, what is the impact of country size, okay, and dominance, right? So as a citizen, would you prefer to live in a big country or a small country, okay? And the answer is not clear, right? So if you look at 9 of the 10 richest countries in the world are smaller, like, Singapore, Dubai, whatever, right? Like, and so why would you want to be in a big country? Okay. So the main advantage historically of being big is that you get economies of scale in the provision of public goods like defense. Okay. So important relation in defense, their size matters. Okay. Like,
Yeah.
so, but when it comes to, so size gives you many advantages. It gives you advantage in defense. It gives you advantage in market size. It gives you advantage in terms of insurance. Okay. But size also comes with two fundamental costs for governance. Right? The two fundamental costs is that you have to, the bigger you grow, the more variation you have to accommodate, okay, in your policy choices, right? So if you look at kind of our language debates right now, okay, like that is the core, right? Like, so that when you want to impose a policy that is kind of in the middle, like, the people who are not there, the bigger you are, the more difference there is, and people want their diversity, right? So historically, that's kind of why secessionist movements have always happened kind of in the periphery of kind of the core, because when the core tries to impose something, the periphery says, like, I don't want to be part of you. Okay. So, which is the fundamental cost of size, because the bigger you get, the more diversity you have to accommodate. Okay. So, that's problem number one. Problem number two is it also hurts governance because of the distance between the citizens and the government. So, when you put more distance, government becomes less responsive, less agile. Okay. So, which is why if you look at kind of many of the richest countries in the world are small. Okay. Now,
so it's better to be in a large country which is appropriately decentralized, right?
so, but this is where I'm going with this, right? So where I'm going with this is to say that how do you get the benefits of both size and kind of the benefits of being small, right? And that is why the institution of federalism, right? Like, is this kind of device that is trying to get you the best of both worlds, right? So when done well, the logic of federalism is that the functions that benefit from scale should be sitting in the central government. The functions that need to accommodate diversity should sit, say, at a state level. And the functions that need to respond to local information, like, is the teacher absent or not? Like, should sit with the local government, right? How can a chief minister or a prime minister or a chief minister make sure that the teacher is attending the school, right? That has to be a local government function. Okay. So the logic, therefore, which is why one of the most important points in the federalism chapter is most of us tend to think about federalism as a hierarchy. Okay, think center is more important than state and more important than local. That's not right. From the citizen's perspective, the differentiation is not by hierarchy. The differentiation is by function. Okay, there are some functions that local government can do better. There are some functions that state government can do better, and some functions that central government can do better. Okay, so by that logic, from the citizen's perspective, it is actually optimal for, it's not about, again, what is the right amount of decentralization fiscal. The point is which function should. So from a citizen's perspective, it often makes sense for health and education and service delivery to be local, because that's how you get the accountability, right? So where India ends up being incredibly over-centralized, okay? So if you look at decentralization, by what fraction of total budgets are spent in the control, not spent locally, but controlled by local government. In India, so just for perspective, in China, that number is over 50%. So over 50% of
But the
total
local government,
public
which is the third tier.
China happens in the local government. In the US, that's about 25%. In India, that is 3%. Okay. In fact, that number is over. Now that number has gone up to 5%. But it turns out that it's all driven by Maharashtra, because Maharashtra is actually the most decentralized fiscally. It's about 20-25%. You take Maharashtra out, we're still at 3%. Okay. So, which means that we are incredibly overcentralized. But also, we often think over-centralization is mainly between center and state. But in fact, it's state to local. I mean, where most of that over-centralization happens.
And then let's discuss both of this, center and state to local. First, center to state, right? One of the things that you say in the book is, in general, it's a good idea for states to be smaller. That's one of the things that come up in the book. So just to kind of put it out, what's the right number of states for India, you think? And what are the principles on which you decide what's the right side?
That's what I was going to say. See, I think I prefer to talk about principles because the exact number, again, there's no silver bullet, right? But I think the basic principle is the following, okay, which is that the benefits of size are coordination, okay, whereas the cost of size is lack of responsiveness. So as the population of India has grown, so here is just for perspective. India has more people than the entire Western Hemisphere put together, okay? More than North America, Central America, South America. If you took a globe and saying here is half of the world from 180 degree, from the Greenwich Meridian to the date line, India has more people than that entire half of the world, okay? So you don't have a government of the Western Hemisphere, okay, that is trying to basically govern service delivery, right? So, and China is the only country of comparable size. And it's like over 10 times more decentralized than India, okay? And so one of the key cross-cutting challenges for us, right, is that we are way too centralized and that hurts governance in every way. And you see this, right? The problem, again, even like politically committed chief ministers, for example, are not able to take on public sector unions because the numbers are too big. But why should the chief minister have to even worry about whether the teacher is showing up to the village? Because if that appointment is controlled in the village, the ultimate stakeholder is the parent. So if you don't show up, I fire you. Okay. So why do we not have that? Now, there are very important reasons for that. Okay. So before we kind of criticize our governments, the reason India is so over-sectorized, and it's useful to understand the
historical context, you've talked about.
There are three key reasons, right? There is political, economic, and social reason, right? So the political reason is at the time of independence, the founders were most concerned of holding the country together, okay? You just come through partition, you're trying to absorb and integrate over 500 princely states, right? So there is no other federation where the central government was made so powerful, okay? So that was the political. The economic reason was, again, we believed that the key to development was huge kind of state-sponsored industrial projects and investments, which only the government of India could mobilize the resources for. But the really interesting question is is the social reason, and that is why the state is so much more powerful than local. Okay? And the social reason for over-centralizing is because the founders, including Dr. Ambedkar, did not trust local elites that they would allow the marginalized and kind of, historically underprivileged castes to get educated, right? So you were trying to kind of bring modernity of kind of universal democracy on the soil of one of the most unequal societies in the world that had both kind of caste and patriarchy and feudalism, right? So the reason we're over-centralized is the Indian project in some ways is a modernizing state trying to counteract a traditional society.
Okay? You talk about that in the book, but at the same time, that was at the time of independence. Just there's nothing to say that we cannot kind of take.
And so that's why, so what I'm saying today is that we have, it served a purpose, but it is dramatically hurting governance quality, right? Dramatically. And now 75 years after independence, education rates have gone from 20% to 80%. The smartphones means that everybody has information and it is much, much harder to have that level of kind of discrimination oppression that you have. So the optimal direction of kind of policy in India
has to be this way, right? And I want to talk about specific levers, and you've discussed many levers. So in the center state, there are multiple levers again. We'll come to one by one. But one is also to just reduce the size of the state. Some states are almost kind of ungovernable. So how do you kind of decide that?
No, see, it's a tricky one. And it's a tricky one because partly it depends on kind of so one way to say this is in the right time to kind of carve out a separate state is when there is enough kind of local sentiment in an area, okay, that says that, listen, we just are not getting governed well, and therefore we should be our own unit. Okay? So I don't think
we are getting ignored in the larger speech.
Yeah, so I think again it's a mistake to say top down, suddenly say, okay, tomorrow we are going to break up the state. Okay, I think that will be a disaster, right? Because even for a new state to function effectively, it needs a certain social cohesion about what the state stands for, right? So whether it was Uttarakhand or Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, there were well-established movements that said these areas are distinct. Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand were the much more tribal areas and kind of, for forested areas. and that the kind of policies they needed were different. Okay. So Telangana again, like kept being, the region is different, and it was historically part of the Nizam's, administration. Whereas kind of coastal Andhra was part of a presidency, right? So there was genuine historical differences. Now, Maharashtra, you might argue that Vidarbha is meaningfully different. UP, I think when Mayawati was chief minister, and even in the assembly, they had said there should be four broad areas of like Awadh and Madhya Pradesh and Purvanchal and Bundelkhand, right? And so I think it makes sense, but it has to be driven organically, by kind of domestic kind of saying, okay, we can be governed better. Now, but where there is also very robust evidence is being not just in terms of number of states, right? But there's evidence that even like one of the underappreciated reforms in India was what N.T. Ramarao did in Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so and very few people are aware of this, right? But Andhra and Telangana are the only places where you don't have blocks, but you have mandals. Okay, so in a typical district in India is about 2.5 to 3 million people in UP Bihar with about 10 blocks and about 2.5 lakhs people per block. So, but Andhra, they went to mandals where each block roughly became about 4 mandals. So the block became about 60 to 75,000 as opposed to 2.5 lakhs. And now we have a lot of evidence showing how that brought government closer to people and actually improved governance and service delivery. You can look at border villages that kind of dramatically became closer to to block headquarters and how development outcomes improved there because you've reduced the distance, from the administrative center. And then there's another beautiful.
This is a district's mandal block.
Well, no, the block district. So effectively, mandals are the same as blocks, right?
Mandal but within every mandal,
but you have districts. You created many more blocks by creating mandals. So that's what happened. And then there's another beautiful study now in UP, okay, that shows that having your own gram panchayat, right? So the interesting thing is, if you're a village with population under 1,000, if you're above 1,000, you get your own GP. If you're under 1,000, you're clubbed with another GP,
yes,
right? And so what the study shows is that villages with population just above 1,000 have much better governance because they have their own GP. So you get like higher level of citizen.
Not just about states, the same thing also applies at every level, right? The concept also applies at great. One another idea that you talk about from a decentralization perspective between center and the state is how the money of the centrally sponsored schemes is used, right? And you suggest a very interesting 70-20-10 kind of cut of that. Firstly, can you explain centrally sponsored schemes for everyone, and then what's this idea about 70-20-10?
Correct. So I think the centrally sponsored schemes are an attempt by the government of India to take on historically education and help us state subjects. Okay, but states, there was huge variation. Some states did a lot, other states did not. Right. So government of India felt that these key development areas are too important, to allow so much variation, right? So the logic of centrally sponsored schemes was to put a certain amount of resources to ensure a certain minimal level of service provision. And under that, the government of India crafts scheme guidelines and also provides a fair bit of funding. But states have to put matching funding. Okay. Now, the positive of the centrally sponsored scheme,
and the execution happens by the
execution happens at the state. Now, the positive is kind of, you could say that programs like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan wouldn't have happened, right? And that kind of help promote like universal school enrollment in a way that certain states were otherwise not acting on it. Okay. Now, but the problem is basically that, again, it goes back to what I was saying about the cost of size, that when you have to kind of govern an entire country with a common policies, it becomes incredibly suboptimal because the variation becomes so big. So the cost of centrally sponsored schemes is often there are Kerala has no need for certain things that are in CSS and conversely, right? So the cost in terms of uniformity, there is a cost in terms of being just a lot more kind of procedural compliance and paperwork. But also what the research shows is that simply providing money, right? Typically doesn't get you the effects because governance is weak, right? So the logic of a 70-20-10, and this is not even about centrally sponsored scheme, but it applies even at the state level, even from state to district, right? Is to say, let's have certain principles of budget allocation. Let's say 70% is allocated on an equality principle, okay, where every child gets the same amount. About 20% is allocated on an equity principle, whereby you say, let's identify the most underperforming areas and have a sliding scale, whereby you provide more resources. But then the key innovation is then the effectiveness part, right? Saying let's put at least 10% that is tied to performance and tied to improvements. Because again, the research is very clear that money alone doesn't help, but money plus governance is where you get the.
So from the center to state lens, in this, the 70% will be proportionate to the size of the state in terms of population. 20% will be proportionate to the more vulnerable states or the backward states will get us likely to get
You
more.
can just take the indicators and say,
And depending on what the scheme is, you can take the indicators and accordingly kind of, and 10% but is given to states who are showing more improvement. And same the state does with the can do with the metrics, as long as they're measuring the indicator at district level.
see, and to be completely honest, I think politically this is almost better from state to district than center to state. Okay, because you kind of get into the kind of government opposition type of thing, okay, saying, oh, we are coming up with
When you're doing center to state, with state that is not an issue.
state that is not an issue, right? Like, I mean, to come se come up state ke andar you can do this and improve governance, right? I mean, by starting to put more salience and really taking the fact that there is so much variation within a state much more seriously. So yeah.
In fact, you also make the point that states which are doing well should also be given the flexibility to design it as per their this, because there's some reason why they're doing well. They're executing it well. So rather than defining a central guideline and enforcing it, we give that
So my simple suggestion there is
autonomy on kind of
process, right? So my simple suggestion for centrally sponsored scheme modification. See, performance-based financing might be too difficult because of measurement and politics, okay? But at the very least, we should be able to do performance-based autonomy, okay? Because see, the logic of centrally sponsored schemes was to say there are a bunch of underperforming states that I need to come and intervene to make sure that they get up to a certain base, okay? But there's a national average. So there are states that are much better than the national average. So why do you want to handicap those states, like, by putting your norms which are really designed for the underperforming states, right? So at the very least, you can say that for states that have at least, meaningfully better development indicators, the only requirement will be that when I give you the money, that you have to spend it in that sector. Okay, because I don't want you to divert it somewhere else. So if I'm giving you education money, you spend in education. But you spend how you want. At least have a certain amount of performance-based autonomy. Right?
Yeah. So, the last point on centralization, decentralization is a between state and local, where you say some of the functions can actually be given to the local bodies. And you mentioned about attendance of school teachers or even deployment of school teachers and then appointment of school teachers. Can you explain that? Because that's to me again is a very, very powerful implementable idea which can really improve the attendance of teachers and the quality of
Exactly, right? And so again, so I mean, again, thank you for reading the book so carefully and picking up on all of these kind of ideas, right? So because the challenge in some ways is almost too many ideas. So how do you pick and how do you prioritize? How do you fulfill it? But see, again, what I'm calling this is nuanced decentralization, right? So if you say that I'm going to send all the money and control to the local government, then you have to worry about elite capture. And there's ample data that says like, that you will get typically a more influential upper caste person, like, controlling the resources. And then you have to worry about different margins of equity. Okay. But the problem today with the government employed guy is there is zero accountability like being out there, right? So again, like that empanelment idea, what I'm suggesting is that let's have a government exam for recruitment as an empanelment device that says you need to pass this process to be eligible for appointment as a teacher. But being eligible doesn't guarantee you the job. That the job is actually controlled by the local panchayat, like and so if they can appoint anybody who's empaneled, so then if you don't show up, if you're not performing well, then you can, then you can be let go and I can find somebody else. So that is a way of empowering the local government, but by providing some checks and balance.
Yeah. So
now the other thing, frankly, which I think,
and also you go on to say that it's not just that. So you're empaneled at the state level, which ensures quality. Then you're appointed by amongst the teachers who are empaneled in that panchayat. The kind of panchayat picks whom they want to appoint. That ensures accountability.
Be empaneled from the panchayat. You can be empaneled in the district.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You're from district, whatever. So then it ensures accountability that you're showing up.
Exactly.
You can also decide. Sometimes you also go on and say that how many teachers are there, because right now the salaries are kind of at a certain level. So let's say 50,000 rupees, 2 teachers, 1 lakh is one school, 2 teachers, and a certain cost. At the same amount of expenditure, you can potentially have more teachers, and that flexibility can be given to the panchayat. So instead of 50,000, you want to give 25,000.
But then that is the next level, right? With the next level of empowerment. Yes. Right? So one level of empowerment, local body is to say, listen, I'm fixing the salary, I'm fixing that. The salary will still go from here, but the job is controlled by you. Okay, so then you have to decide, like, who you're going to employ. Now, the next level of doing that is to say, let me change the structure of teacher pay. To say, instead of having like, this uniform super high pay, I might kind of saying, okay, I will guarantee a certain 50%. Okay, this is a minimum. And the rest is a pool that goes to you as long as you spend on education. Now, you might choose it to pay bonuses to good teachers, or you could choose it to hire more teachers. Now, eventually you might say, listen, the entire budget should be controlled locally. Okay, why should you do that? But that is again a gradual thing. Now, one thing when you're talking decentralization, I think, you didn't mention this, but I want to highlight one of the most kind of schizophrenic aspects of the design of our governance structure, okay, which is our democracy itself is not aligning the incentives in the following way, right? Which is the MLAs and MPs are being elected to legislate and write laws, okay? But that is not what their voters want. The voters want them to develop and deliver. They want constituency services, okay? So the funny thing is, you are electing somebody to deliver something on which they have zero authority, okay? So the reason the MLAs and MPs all want control over postings and transfers is that is their only instrument for accountability to get any work done. Agar wo bhi nikal gaya to, like, I mean, they have no control on the administration, okay? So then again, you are in this really low level equilibrium, right? I mean, where that politicizes postings and transfers, and then it makes, it deprofessionalizes the bureaucracy, right? But imagine a modified model where the MLA or the MLA would much rather be elected as an empowered mayor, okay, where you are elected by your constituencies to deliver services there, and you have full executive control, like, I mean, of kind of the machinery of the government. You hire, you fire, you pay, you promote, because you face accountability. So today you are accountable for something that you have no power to deliver, right? So you kind of make democracy work better by better aligning that. And once you do that, I think many MLAs would rather be empowered mayors, like, because it gives you the ability to deliver, right? And then, of course, there's a separate question about, like, maybe the legislators are kind of, how you do that and some reforms there. But broadly speaking, I think, see, on decentralization, there's a very, very powerful quote, right, at the end of a chapter that I use from Ashwin Mahesh. He says, the best way to solve India's many problems is to increase the number of problem solvers. Okay. Like, I mean, and the more we look to some savior, right, at some higher level of government, the more we delay, like, the actual progress, right? So I think, see, decentralization is not an unalloyed kind of positive. There will be cases of capture, there will be cases of corruption. Okay. All of that will happen, right? So decentralization will not prevent corruption. Okay. But think about China. China did not prevent corruption, okay? But China has managed to grow essentially. What is the single most important lesson to learn from China for India, okay? Is we often learn the wrong lesson. We think it succeeded because it was the strong centralized government. And in fact, some of China's biggest disasters have happened when there has been unchecked power. So whether it was the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, there is the key to Chinese development was basically governance reforms, right? So
It happened during Deng's time, right?
Right. And the governance reforms which implements this key principle, which is autonomy on process and accountability on outcomes. So then you have local mayors who were empowered to do what it took to deliver, and their own career prospects started depending on performance. Now, let's be clear. There was corruption. Of course, there was corruption. Okay. But what these guys did was they functioned like minority shareholders in a growth enterprise. Like, because the corruption would have taken the form of they probably had some equity in their own companies. Okay. So सेटोन एंटरप्राइज था या कोई एंटरप्राइज था उसमें उसका कुछ शेयर्स था बट दैट मीन्स हिज incentives are aligned with letting the golden goose grow. Okay, like, whereas today we did talk too much about the jobs chapter, but one of the most important points I want to make about jobs is that it's not even about policy; it's about incentive alignment. Okay, if you're a small and micro enterprise, your biggest main point is getting your permissions and kind of all the palms you have to grease off and getting that done. Okay. So if you're able to kind of saying a collector is kind of going to be monitored on total amount of investments in economic activity and empowered to kind of line up the ducks needed to kind of make it investment friendly, it is those kind of micro alignment of incentives, right? I mean, that we need to work on, and it's not just about the policy. So I think that's the most important lesson. And the value of greater decentralization is mota moti, you are better aligning the incentives because those are the people who live there. And so you're getting the incentive right for government.
Great. So, Karthik, we've covered 4 themes, right? We've talked about personnel, we've talked about the the growth versus human development bit. We have talked about public finance a bit, and we've talked about decentralization. What we're not doing in the podcast is talk about the different verticals that you go deep into the book about. But I'll want you to share how you've kind of linked the first with the second. But before we get there are 2 very interesting concepts I want you to kind of talk about, which I really like from the book. And this come in the context of services being provided by the private sector vis-a-vis the government, right? So in especially key service delivery sectors like education, health, and so on, what should the private sector do? What should the government do? How much of private is good? 2 concepts, right? One is a concept of choice, voice, and exit that you talk about. If you can explain that with one example, that'll be great. And then I'll come to the second one.
Yeah. So again, so this is, again, for your listeners, essentially all I'm going to say is like each chapter is like a mini book. Okay. And so people say, why could you make this shorter than 600 pages? And my answer is to write 600 pages, I have read 60,000 pages, right? So you're already getting a crisp 1% synthesis with 200 pages of notes and references, right? So what Gaurav is picking on here is this really powerful idea from Albert Hirschman, okay, on exit, voice, and loyalty. Right? And so the basic idea is that if you want to improve your outcomes in any relationship, okay, let's say you're a customer with a company, okay, or you are a citizen, right, or you could be even in a relationship, right, like I mean, and now if you're unhappy about something, you basically have two options, right? You can exercise your voice, which is to explain why you're unhappy and then hope that the other person listens and acts. Or the other option is exit. You say, listen, like you're not listening and I don't need to deal with you. Okay. So basically, if you think about customers and and companies, right? So basically, you might say, okay, you might do some customer complaints once or twice. But if they don't fix it, you say, I'm fed up and I'm going to the competition. Okay. So the point is you can get accountability through voice and accountability through exit. Now, in general, what happens is accountability in market spaces works much more through the threat of exit, right? Because you say, I don't like, you're not serving my needs and I'm in the competition, okay? That is, accountability in political spaces works much more through voice because you don't say, I'm unhappy, I'm giving up my citizenship, right? Like, I mean, you engage and you try to fix things, okay? So the whole point is that when you think about service delivery, right, when you think about the poor and the marginalized, right, so they have the option of voice, okay, they can say, I government, please deliver it. Or they have an option of exit, which is saying, I go to the private guy, okay. Now, what has happened today is because the government is so unresponsive, right, I mean, to service delivery concerns, pretty much the entire Indian elite has exited to the private sector. Okay. Now, and this has it further weakens the government because you have removed the voice of the people with the most powerful voice because they have chosen to exit, right? So, and if you look at governance in India in general, it's not like we haven't done well in some areas, right? So airports are fantastic. But why? Because they're used by the elites, right? So elites don't exit from certain. So the services that elites have not exited from are the services that the government pays attention to. Okay. So now, and this is not again.
And you explain this with Russian, right? That in the Russian shops currently this thing goes to the PDS shop owner and then they distribute the ration at a subsidized or free to the citizen. If you can provide an option,
So where I'm coming with this is, see, what happens is that therefore the poor end up being doubly disadvantaged. Right? They're doubly disadvantaged because they don't have enough voice in the public system and they don't have the resources to exit. Okay. So the key here is how can you empower the poor, like with more options. And the insight is increasing the exit option actually also increases your voice option. So on the previous example is a good one. Okay. So today, effectively, where does the corruption in the PDS often happens from the fact that the local dealer has a monopoly in delivering benefits to the citizens.
giving grains to the citizen.
In giving you grades, okay? So even if there's leakage, right? Like, I mean, he might take 20%. What are you going to do? Because you don't have any other option.
He'll go and sell it in the open market because the prices are much higher.
Prices are different. Now, so but tomorrow, like, I mean, and some of this is happening, but if you
also sometimes the quality of what is being delivered might be poor, right? So either quality is poor or it may get diverted to the market.
That poor partly because you adulterated it and diverted some of the grades. Okay, so that is how the two happen. Right? Like, I mean, so thoda diversion hota hai. Like, I mean, you have to show the weighing scale, so you have adulterated with put some sand. Now, so the simple point is that there has been a bunch of debate about DBT instead of PVS. Okay, so that you give people the option of buying on the open market. Okay, now, there's a problem with that. The problem with that is the reason we have the PDS is partly because of procurement, okay? Because you have ad procurement, you're sitting on the stocks and you have to distribute it, which is why you have the PDS. But for a moment, if you think about it just from the citizens' perspective, that the logic is very simple. The logic is that you have a choice. You have a choice of taking your PDS from any one of shops. And you have a choice, if you don't like any of them, to take an equivalent amount of DBT. And then you can just go buy in the market, okay? And by providing citizens with that choice, the budget is the same, okay? But you're now empowering them with the option of exit. And because they have that option, it also improves the accountability of the government guy because it strengthens your voice because you can exit. Okay. So it's the same thing in any employee like, again, coming to some humor, right? What is the most legendary recruitment ad in India in the past 20 years? It is the Hadi Sadhu ad, right? Like, so in Naukri, right? So the point is having the exit option is what gives you the voice to say what you truly think, right? Like, so, but which means if I know that an employee has an outside option, then I'm much more likely to listen to the grievances and saying, well, let me make your life better, right? So strengthening exit also strengthens voice. So that is how, like, you can empower the poor by empowering them with more choice.
Great, Karthik. So the second concept that I was referring to, which I found really interesting, is when you share in the context of the private sector that those government departments which are in a core service providing role, let's say education, have to think of their role in three distinct kind of ways. One is the role as a policy maker, where you see the private sector or the private schools in the education case as an ally, right? Then a role of a regulator, where you see both the government and the private as equals. And then a role of a service provider, where actually are running the government schools, for instance, where you see the private sector as a competitor. And we work so much with the state governments on some of these topics, but this distinction is actually almost, I would say, non-existent, right? That's not the way typically anyone kind of thinks. So, and it's not just education, applicable to any service sector. So I think something on this would be.
I think, again, so thanks for reading so carefully and picking on all of these really important concepts, right? But the key point, and it's worth repeating, right? Which is because you have such a large private share, right? In health today, like over 60-70% of primary healthcare is private. In education in urban areas, it's over 50%, right? So the distinction becomes important because as a policy maker, right, I care about improving education for every Indian, right? And whether it's the public or a private, it is a mean towards the goal of improving education, okay? As a regulator, I have to treat everybody equally. But the problem is, as a provider of education, I see the private sector as a competition, okay? And now you have seen this, and I've seen this, is that because over 95%, if not 99% of government budgets and government personnel are allocated to government as provider.
Third function.
Right? Which means that they instinctively see the private sector with suspicion. Okay. And it also means that they're not able to apply their minds to how do you actually leverage kind of the private sector to optimize outcomes for the citizens. And, and I think I've heard most health secretaries, right, think of their job as running the public health department, whereas like to ensure it. Some of the most effective things you can do is to make markets work better. Okay. And very few people actually think about that. But let me give you a very powerful example, right, about how the confusion of these two roles can really hurt national welfare, right? And the powerful example comes from our history with aviation regulation, okay? So a tiny country like Singapore, that is a man-made country, okay, gets more tourists in a year than India, okay, with our kind of millennia-old civilization, right? And one key reason for this used to be, for many years, our kind of aviation policy. Why? Because the government as policymaker was trying to protect government as provider and trying to protect Air India. Okay, because what happens is in any route you have multiple providers, and because Air India was less competitive, right? If you increase the capacity, then the market share would go mainly to the foreigners. So the way to protect Air India was to control capacity so that you got at least some demand. Okay. But in doing that, right, you effectively dramatically hurt tourism in India, because you were hurting kind of the inflow of people. Whereas Singapore, this Chutku country, it basically said, we will do open skies. Anybody can come and land, anybody can take any passenger, drop, pick up, do what you want, let markets rule. Okay. And therefore, so many airlines effectively, would kind of, BA Qantas, they would do these 2-day stopovers, 3-day stopovers, you stop. So that is then how kind of it galvanized the entire tourism economy. And we've kind of stifled all of those effects in the interest of trying to protect one national carrier. You see, so that's then an example of how this kind of cognitive disconnect, saying how to protect Air India. No, your job is to the Indian citizen.
And we can see the effect of it now, that Air India is kind of this thing, that the role of the government is more seeing as policy, as a regulator. Yeah, but I'm saying the effect on the aviation sector is kind of visible because the government is thinking more policy, government is seeking more regulation.
Exactly, as opposed to provision. Exactly, right? So the same logic applies to education, same logic applies to health. So for example, one of the lowest hanging fruit, right? In fact, we're trying to do this now, I think as pilot. But there's some really powerful research showing how making markets work better, okay, which is just providing citizens with information on the quality of all the providers in your catchment area leads to dramatic improvement without much expense, because now suddenly, you're solving problems of asymmetry of information, and both government and private start doing better, right?
And this is a more a regulator hat, right?
Exactly, right? So, but that's the point, which is, as a policymaker, you can think about PPPs and how do you procure kind of private providers to function in the public interest. As a regulator, you can think about how to make markets work better. So the key point is you can dramatically improve public welfare by doing those things. The subtle point is even that requires state capacity for procurement and regulation. So you also just even using the private sector well, you need state capacity, which is something we are underinvesting in.
No, Karthik, we can continue on this endlessly, but the good part is we've been able to at least touch upon the different horizontal things that you've talked about in the book. Now, I want you to share how somebody should read the book so that that combines with some of the vertical sector specific ideas that you talk about.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, yeah, so that's exactly right? So, which is, there are 6 core chapters, right, under building an effective state. And we've covered 5 of them. One we didn't talk about was data, actually, which is the foundational chapter. But basically, these 6 chapters are applied to organizational effectiveness, whether it's government or whether it's the private sector, right? So, the pillar is data, right, which is data outcome measurement. What are you managing for? Then there's personnel, right? How do you hire? How do you train? How do you pay? How do you promote? Then there is public finance on expenditure and revenues. Then there is federalism and decentralization. And then there is state and market. So each of these chapters are core components of kind of effective state functioning. And they're also interlinked, right? So part of the challenge of state capacity is because it is a chakravyuha where everything is connected to everything, right? So the reason the book is this size, it's simply impossible to do justice because everything is connected to everything, right? But then, like I said, the reason we care about building an effective state is not just for its own sake, but it's really to improve the lives of citizens, correct? Like, I mean, so then the second half then says, let's pick 6 critical sectors, okay? Because obviously state capacity can be used for many things. But these 6 critical sectors are education and skills, health and nutrition, police and public safety, courts and justice, social protection and welfare, and jobs, productivity, and economic growth. Now, why do I pick these 6 sectors? It goes back to our Bhagavati Sen debate of growth and development. Okay, so the big ideological kind of camps in development become those who favor more growth and those who favor more individual kind of the human development. But in picking these 6 sectors, you don't have to choose between Bhagavati and Sense because they matter for both. Okay, because every one of these sectors is intrinsically important, right? So being educated gives me a more empowered life, even if I don't work. So let me give you a concrete example of how the intrinsic and the instrumental approaches will vary, okay, when it comes to, say, education, right? So in the intrinsic view in education, there should be no gender discrimination, okay? That gets me because every human, every child matters equally. In the instrumental view, it is completely rational to prioritize boys' education because you say the girls' labor force participation is low. So if the reason for the education is so that you will earn more, then I will prioritize the boys. Okay. So that's a good sharp example of where the intrinsic moral view and the instrumental view will conflict. Okay. But so but the point is that these 6 sectors, they are all intrinsically good, right? We want to be educated, we want to be healthy, we want to feel safe, right? And justice is kind of, again, we did talk about courts, but let me just highlight how it is both a moral issue and an economic issue, right? It's a justice, improving our justice system is a moral issue because almost 70% of our incarcerated population are under trials, which means they are kept in custody without being found guilty.
Yeah.
So you've effectively made a mockery of the idea of innocent until proven guilty, right? So it's a human rights disaster. But it's also an economic disaster, right? Because there's this beautiful study recently that shows how augmenting kind of efficiency and capacity of district courts led to a dramatic improvement in total economic activity because 60 to 70% of these court cases are land and credit, which are 2 critical factors of production that are being locked up without being used because of the court cases, right? So therefore the justice system, again, so what is nice about these 6 sectors is they all matter intrinsically, but also instrumentally, right? Because better education and skills makes you productive. That's good for growth. Being healthy makes you productive. Feeling safe increases labor force participation and investments. Better courts, make kind of the economy function better. And then, like I said, well-designed social protection can be a trampoline that allows people to make the investments that get you growth. Yeah. And then jobs in the end is, a job is not just a source of income. It's also a source of identity. It's a source of meaning. It's a source of kind of connection. So there's intrinsic value in jobs and there's obviously instrumental value, right? So that's kind of how this comes together. And then last 2 chapters on kind of making it happen. There is this key chapter in reimagining institutions about how do you kind of not just think of these reforms as piecemeal that one motivated minister or secretary does, but how can this become kind of deeply embedded as a better way of ongoing government functioning? And finally, how can we all contribute, right, towards this session? So that's
And I think the good part is people who are working in specific sectors, for instance, can actually read the horizontal chapters and then the vertical chapter of this thing, right? Of course,
so it is also designed. So one of the challenges of writing the book is how do you make it modular in a way that you can read the intro chapter and jump to any chapter you want and you will still get a lot out of it. So you don't have to read it in sequence. Yeah.
So we'll park the content here, Karthik. As I'm saying, continue to say, we can just keep on discussing this for a very long day, but I'll kind of pause here. I want to shift the focus a little bit on the journey of writing the book, right? And I know that you've taken kind of 5+ years to kind of put all of it together. A lot of that focus on simplifying things without simplifying the communication, without simplifying the ideas, as you say. But what's been the process of writing the book? And process, and what did you do first, then what did you do, then, and also the timelines also along with it. That'll give a sense of what went behind this.
Yeah. Oh, see, I think, every book is unique. Every book journey is different. And I think, so the good news and the bad news for me about the book is, the good news is, as an academic, most of the research that underlies the book I already knew. Okay. So it's not like I had to go and do this, because over the years, your job is to read papers and write and synthesize and teach. Okay. So a lot of the ideas were already in my head. Okay. That's good news. The bad news is, as an academic, I probably brought unrealistically high writing standards in terms of kind of the precision of every sentence, every argument, every reference, right? And it is frankly not even a sustainable model of, like, how a book like this can be done. Okay.
Because
So
the reader, most 99% readers may not even kind of notice some of that kind
may
of
not appreciate.
yeah.
So it is written at a level that kind of even a leading expert. So that's the thing, right? To write in a way that even a 10th standard student or first standard college student can understand, but even the world's leading expert should not find anything wrong. Okay. So that is essentially the rage of what I've tried to do here, right? So I think the process was, I think the idea of a book like this came partly from actually the finance secretary of Telangana, who had heard my podcast of my course on the Indian economy, right?
When was this?
So my
Not the podcast, the idea.
starting to tell me this in around 2018. And so he said, listen, he said, I've heard these lectures, I've heard this thing. And one of the biggest public services you could do, is to kind of convert all of these ideas into a book, because he said, listen, all our Indian economy courses for the most part still tend to be very kind of rote learning, fact based. First plan mein ye hua, second plan mein ye hua, ye budget allocation hua. But there is very little first principles kind of explanation the way you do in your course, because that's a lot of this I do in my teaching. So he had heard that. So he said, this is what you should do. But at that point, I had no idea how long it was going to become. Okay. So when I started, I said, "Theek hai." And my original proposal to Penguin was about half the size. It was about 120,000 words, which I thought I would do in 3 years. In the end, it became over 230,000 words and took me about 5 years. And I think it's because once you start writing, you just see everything is connected. And then it's like, you couldn't do justice to the complexity of the topic, right? And so I think the process was, outlining. I had, obviously so the other thing that was very, very, very difficult is that most academic work these days is co-authoring. Okay. So you have people to brainstorm with. So a single authored book was, I think, emotionally just incredibly challenging, because you're kind of taking it all on yourself. But what I did have is I had different PhD students helping me as research assistants on different chapters, right? So which meant that basically I would know the studies, I would know the broad point, but I would ask them to go confirm, do the lit reviews, help me kind of just make sure that the facts were right. A lot of fact checking, a lot of and therefore, at least at a chapter level, I would have somebody to have conversation with, right? So that was very important. And then I, also had kind of organizing help from, because over the years, I have such large research programs. I have a research director who himself has a PhD from Harvard. So this is like an outstanding, talent. And he's been with me now for almost 8 years, right? So he was almost like the chief organizer of the project, right? And kind of converting my thoughts into saying, okay, this is here, this is here. So we would often just walk and talk and brainstorm this. So the real challenge in this kind of writing is not the ideas as much as the structuring, right? Because the written word is linear. I know how everything is connected, but how do you sequence this? It's insanely hard, right? So it took a lot of kind of whiteboarding, outlining, seeing the flow, seeing, and then doing that first for the whole book, then doing that at the level of chapters. And then you would just saying, okay, now let's just sit and write, 2 pages and seeing how it goes, right? So, but yeah, and to be honest, I don't think this book would have happened but for the pandemic, okay? Because pandemic meant I was not traveling, because travel is the single biggest killer of writing productivity, right? So which meant that I was able to dedicate kind of undisturbed time, and without those chunks of just, and it is just so frustrating, right? Because
How long would you write in one go?
it just varies. It varies. So I think the one thing which I see, the other challenge for me is I think much better when I'm walking and talking rather than just sitting in front of a computer, right? So I need to just pace. So often there were times when I would be on a call, like and my assistant would just be typing what I was saying, right? So it was just my first draft of thoughts. Saying, so there's just dumps of ideas, okay, saying, "Theek hai." Then you look at that, then you organize, then you write. So it was an incredibly complex process. But I don't think the typical book goes through that because it's not kind of, like I said, an academic who's trying to do things at that level of precision, but while also simplifying. So the nature of this task is not some,
It's not a common.
and it's not even something I think I would ever do again in my life. So in fact, I think one parallel that, so multiple people have mentioned to me that the closest analogy after reading it is a bit like Ram Goha's, like, and Unity After That. It's the same side. But, I don't want to be presumptuous in terms of saying that the book is in that class. But the one thing Ram said, which I think applies to me as well, he says that I think he was at the same age when I took this project on, right? Like in kind of roughly mid dot.
First one.
Yeah, India After That,
Yeah.
that classic, right? Like that he did it in his mid 40s.
Yeah.
So
But he did 2 more after that.
yeah. But again, those were still more specific, right? The Gandhi books were like, it's not so encyclopedic in scope, right? So I think this one has that scope, right? Where it's kind of taking on the entire snare. And I think one thing I relate to what he said is that the mid 40s were the right time because these are really the peak of your academic years. So you have enough experience to have something to say, but you have the energy to take on something of this kind of complexity.
Must have been a emotional ride also for you.
Yeah, it's been, and I would be honest, right? I'm always a very happy, cheerful guy, but I think the closest I have come to having mental health issues, right? Like was kind of in the last days of the book. And mainly because, not because of the book, but because of how many other commitments were accumulating, right? Like, so I had commitments to co-authors, commitments to others. And at some point it's like, listen, that I just have to get this done, okay? But then the problem is you can devote a day to writing and you can put that time in your calendar, but you need not be happy with what is there at the end of it, right? So there is you can have consistency in effort, but there's huge variation in the product outcome. So which is just hugely frustrating. But that's why Burak, who's my research director, like, he would just say, boss, it's a process. You just have to trust the process. Just trust the process. Just trust the process, okay? Which is, if you do 4 hours a day. So the simple discipline I would have was to say that structure, and which I still do, okay? Because now with CGIS and other things, I have a bunch of real world commitments. But my very simple structure of a work day is, when I'm not traveling, is morning 8:30 to 1 is protected for writing. So no meetings, no calls, absolutely nothing, right? So that is kind of the deep work time, right? And then after lunch afternoon is basically when I do my meetings and this thing and anything that revolve in travel. So what he would say is, if you get one chunk of 4 hours a day and if you keep doing this, it will happen. Okay?
But how do you decide कि अब हो गया? Yeah, let's stop and kind of just before, because otherwise you can keep on improving, doing, refining.
No, absolutely. Right. So I can see the first is you have a sense. Okay. And this is where I think being a researcher, because you write for a living, right? You therefore have a very finely tuned antennae. And this is why, in fact, people say, what did your editor do? The most important thing my editor did was he got out of my way. He just let me be myself. And he understood that my standards were so much higher, than most kind of people writing their first book. He said, just let him be. Okay, he'll do it. But yes, so perhaps, it could have been done 1 or 2 iterations earlier. But my process here was, I think the first 10 iteration, and by 10, I don't mean like 10 full drafts, but when I say 10 drafts, I'm talking about reorganizing, like, the ideas are there, it's go move this paragraph, move this. So you do one version, they say, "Nahin, this paragraph belongs here," right? So if you count each of those as kind of one draft, there were probably 10 drafts I just did internally, right? With me and my core team, okay? Like, which might be like, Burak, and then I had another former research manager who then is a fantastic writer. So Vishnu used to actually write for Mick. So in fact, he was excited enough about the project that he said, listen, I know kind of, how important this is. I'm happy to help. So he helped, and he joined CGIS actually as a communication person, so where he was working 50% of the book. So Vishnu at that time was actually really helping with the structuring, right? It was not even editing, it was just structuring, right? And he's saying, okay, as somebody who was writing for Mate, he would say, listen, this is the right level of detail. So those 10 drafts I would have just done with my team, and the core team is Burak and Vishnu. Then after that is when I started sending chapters to people to read. So My main mechanism here of feedback was, I think the acknowledgement's about 7 pages long, right? I mean, because it's a lifetime journey, but also different people. I think there were a few academic colleagues of mine from India who read the entire book. Then there are a couple from government, couple from civil society, couple who are just like, family members in IT who have nothing to do with this, but is your typical average reader who's interested. So I think that, and that was a very, very, very useful process, because even if you get one nugget, okay, from each person, it improved, right? So there's that process of improvement. And then I think my N minus 2 drafts, then you start the more higher stakes readers, like, so people like Dinesh Kapoor or Lad Pritchett, like, who are global gurus. So they would have read the N minus 1 draft, okay, like, so, but as an academic, again, the good news is that over time you have access to kind of some of the smartest people in the world who are thinking about these issues, and therefore, they know that you will respect their time, that you will only put something in front of them when it's kind of worth their attention. So yeah, so that's how it happened.
And how's it's been a year since the book has been out. How's been this 1 year like? What are, let's say, a couple of things that you expected and happened the very same way, similar way, and a couple of things that surprise you also in terms of how the book has been received and what has been
But,
happened. This
I mean, the honest truth is that you just go with the flow, right? I mean, I think any artist, right? Like, you can put all your effort into a creative product, and then the market has a mind of its own, right? Like, I mean, of how it is received. Okay. So I think the only thing I was confident about when it got out, I was like, I am happy. Okay. Like, that I'm satisfied. Okay. Like, I mean, and I have no regrets, right? But it has been incredibly, I think, gratifying, I think, to see it's probably done better than I could have hoped for. Just in terms of, given the size, I think the quality of the engagement, right? It's not about numbers. This is not something that is competing to be like on, bestseller list. That's really about who's reading, like, and the quality of the engagement. And I think whether it's among civil society, civil servants, IS, at different levels of seniority, right? Like, I mean, and I think the other thing which we didn't talk about, which I put in effort, but it also reflects my temperament. But I do think that it is important that I think the book, what I feel very, very grateful about, has been broadly well received by both the right and the left. Okay. And that's very, very difficult in a very polarized time. Right. But that's because I'm not just kind of centrist for the sake of it, but I try to listen to everybody, right? And saying, okay, how can I take the best of what everybody is saying and then come up with a synthesis that we can create a broad national consensus around? Okay. So when I say that this is an agenda that the center left, because the left cares about equity and justice, right? So if you care about equity and justice, there is no better way to deliver at scale than kind of getting the government to be more effective, right? But if you're on the right, you care about value for money, cost effectiveness, and growth, right? And I'm saying, okay, boss, this is exactly what we need to lay the foundations for long-term growth, right? So the hope is therefore to kind of identify kind of a path, given how polarized our discourse is, to identify a path forward that we can build broad consensus around, like, I mean, so that we can take things forward. And I think that was a goal, but I've also been gratified, right? Like, by the extent to which that's happened. I think the only disappointment, if you ask CP, and again, almost everything has been amazing, right? So whether it's meeting chief ministers, who I would remember, I mean, I typically have never asked or sought political meetings, right? Normally, I'll just interact at the finance secretary level. But, now top government officials saying, no, you should meet the political leadership because they are the ones who ultimately have to take the decisions and they need to be exposed to this level of thinking. So I think that engagement, I think, has been very gratifying. One amazing surprise was the president of Singapore, like, was one of the most thoughtful, policymakers globally, right? Former finance minister, deputy prime minister. He read the whole book and sent me a note saying how much he enjoyed it. The Chief Justice Chancellor, like, he read and reached out. So I think these are people I didn't know, like, I mean, and that has been very, very gratifying. The one minor disappointment, which is just that I think the book doesn't sell well in airports. Okay. And I think because it's too big to fit, like, into most carry bags. Okay. So, like, I think it is a book that, as an author, you always want when you travel so much to kind of see in airports. But I think the airports it was there in the international terminals in T3, but I don't think it's kind of been in airport terminals. And maybe just because the size doesn't make it a good airport book. But that's probably the only regret. But other than that, I mean, the other thing is I've also been spending a lot of time. I mean, I just counted. I've given 60 lectures, 60, right? I mean, in the past kind of 9 months, right? And a lot of the time has been spent with students because I think there is a there is a short-term audience of kind of people engaged in governance. But what I really hope will be the long-term impact of the book, right? I mean, is by just shaping and improving the quality of economic understanding, right? I mean, of, lakhs of students coming up in the future years. So, that's the hope. So it's not in that sense a 1-year book. My hope is that it has, a decade
Exactly.
and that's the period over which I'm playing page. There is a global edition that will come out this year. So the other gratifying thing has been how much kind of attention it's been getting from other countries, right? Of people saying these issues apply to us as well. And then we've just started the Hindi translation. So my hope is that by the end of this year, we'll also have a Hindi version out. So
No, I completely agree with you. This is not a book that you can assess the impact of it in 1 year. It's more a decade that you'll know what kind of ripples it is kind of created. But the good part is the timing is perfect, right? This time and this all the talk about Viksit Bharat 2047, right? And there again, the first decade will determine whether we are getting there, how on what trajectory we are, and then this book comes in that sense at the very right time for that interest. There's one thing I'll just end by sharing, right? At Samagr we say, we have this phrase that we sometimes say, which is राष्ट्र निर्माण के यज्ञ में हमारी भी एक आहुति होनी चाहिए, right? So this is probably similar lines, your contribution to the nation building effort. That's everyone is on, right? So thank you.
thank you.
Pleasure,
And the
pleasure
book
talk-
is dedicated to the people of India, right? So that sentiment, I think, does kind of come through.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the most gratifying things, I mean, more than kind of lectures, praise, etc. To me, actually, I would say the thing that I found the most satisfaction from was sometime in December, there was a non-profit in Maharashtra, right? Like, I mean, I had no idea. And they reached out and said how they had read the chapter on data quality and data integrity. And because they were a bunch of tech people, that they worked out a solution and worked with the local district administration to go and implement it in 3,000 schools, right? And so that, I think, is then the true power of MBS, right? I mean, which is you empower change makers with a set of ideas and then kind of really, like I said, increase the number of problem solvers, right? I mean, and that's where I think the real impact.
Great pleasure talking to you, Karthik.
Thank you. All the best. My pleasure.